Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Sound of Time, the Mechanical Clock, and the Reinvention of Daily Life. Before clocks ruled your wall, your wrist, and the quiet glow of your phone at night, time was something softer. You would have felt it rather than measured it. In medieval Europe, time moved according to light, weather, habit, and prayer. It stretched in summer and compressed in winter. It was not divided into identical hours. It did not tick. If you were alive in the early 13th century, the idea that every hour should be exactly the same length would have seemed unnecessary, even strange. Time was not yet a grid. It was a rhythm. You woke when the light allowed it. You worked when the sun was high enough to see by. You rested when darkness made labor impractical. Bells rang, but they did not mark minutes. They called you to moments, prayer, meals, warnings, celebrations. Time belonged to the sky. This older way of experiencing time was deeply practical. Medieval life depended on agriculture, and agriculture depends on seasons, not seconds. Fields do not care about punctuality. Crops grow at their own pace. Animals need feeding when they need it, not at a scheduled minute. For most people, there was little reason to divide the day into precise units. And yet quietly, that was beginning to change. By the late 1200s, medieval towns were growing denser. Trade was increasing. Markets were becoming more complex. Monasteries were coordinating prayers across larger communities. Legal contracts were becoming more common. Slowly, the medieval world began to need something new, a shared, predictable sense of time. Not celestial time, mechanical time. Before the mechanical clock, the most common timekeeping devices were sundials and water clocks. Sundials worked only when the sun was visible. Water clocks, essentially vessels that measured time by the steady flow of water, were better but imperfect. Water froze in winter. It evaporated in summer. Flow rates changed with temperature and pressure. Accuracy was always approximate. That was acceptable for centuries. But as medieval society grew more interconnected, approximation became inconvenient. If you were a merchant waiting for a market gate to open, mid-morning was not specific enough. If you were a monk responsible for maintaining the exact order of daily prayers, you needed more consistency than sunrise and sunset could provide. If you were a city official coordinating labor or enforcing curfews, you needed time that everyone could agree on. This need did not emerge all at once. It crept forward, unnoticed by most people living their ordinary lives. But behind monastery walls and inside growing towns, craftsmen and scholars began experimenting with something radical. A machine that could divide time evenly, regardless of light, season, or weather. The earliest mechanical clocks did not look like the ones you imagine today. There were no faces, no hands, no numbers. They were large iron frameworks, hidden inside towers or monastery buildings. Their purpose was not to show time visually, but to strike bells at regular intervals. These early clocks were driven by weights. Gravity pulled the weights downward, turning gears. The real innovation, however, was the escapement mechanism, a system that released the gears in controlled, repeating steps. This created a steady rhythm. For the first time, time could move forward in equal increments, over and over again, without human intervention. It was not yet accurate by modern standards. Early clocks drifted. They required frequent adjustment, but accuracy was not the point, regularity was. One of the most important early figures associated with this new technology was Richard of Wallingford, an abbot at St. Albans in the early 14th century. He designed one of the most complex mechanical clocks of the medieval world, incorporating astronomical features alongside timekeeping. His work reflected a growing belief that time could be understood, modeled, and controlled through machinery. But even before Richard's designs, simpler clocks were already reshaping daily life. When a town installed a mechanical clock, something subtle but profound happened. Time became public. No longer did each household follow its own rhythm. Instead, a single machine often housed in a tower dictated the day. Bells rang not because someone felt it was time, but because the mechanism said so. You might hear the bell and adjust your behavior accordingly. Work began, work ended, markets opened, gates closed. Over time, these signals trained people to think of time as something external and objective. This was a quiet revolution. In earlier centuries, time belonged to nature. Now it belonged to a device. The church played a major role in this transformation. Monastic life was structured around fixed prayer times, known as the canonical hours. Keeping these hours consistently was considered a spiritual discipline. Mechanical clocks promised regularity, even at night or during bad weather. A clock could ring matins before dawn without relying on a watchful human eye. This suited the medieval religious mindset well. Order, repetition, and discipline were virtues. A machine that embodied those qualities felt almost moral in nature. Yet outside monastery walls, townspeople experienced clocks differently. For them, clocks introduced obligation. If a bell rang to signal the start of work, being late was no longer a matter of judgment, it was measurable. Time became something you could waste, lose, or misuse. You did not need to understand how the clock worked to feel its influence. You only needed to hear it. The earliest public clocks appeared in Italian and English towns in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Cities like Milan, Florence, and London competed to install impressive clock towers, not only for utility but for prestige. A working clock signaled sophistication, organization, and civic pride. It is important to understand how strange this must have felt. For generations, people had lived without a shared mechanical schedule. Now, a machine was telling everyone when to act. Slowly, the idea took hold that time was uniform, that an hour was an hour, no matter the season. This idea would eventually become foundational to modern life, but at the time, it was unsettling. Clocks also changed how people thought about the future. When time is regular and measurable, planning becomes easier. Contracts can specify durations. Wages can be calculated by hours worked. Deadlines begin to make sense. None of this happened overnight. Medieval people did not suddenly become obsessed with punctuality, but the seeds were planted. The mechanical clock did not simply measure time, it reshaped it. And yet, despite its growing influence, the clock was still an imperfect machine. It required maintenance. It depended on skilled craftsmen. It was expensive. Most people never saw the mechanism itself, only the bell and its consequences. As clocks spread, questions followed. Could time truly be divided so neatly? Did mechanical regularity reflect divine order or impose something artificial onto human life? And what would happen as these machines grew more precise, more visible, and more unavoidable? As you listen to the distant bell of a medieval clock echo through a stone-built town, you might begin to wonder, once time has been captured by a machine, can it ever return to being something free and flexible again? When the bell rang from the tower, you did not argue with it, you adjusted. By the middle of the 14th century, mechanical clocks had moved from rare curiosities to familiar presences in many European towns. They were still expensive, temperamental, and impressive, but no longer mysterious. You might not have known how the gears worked or what an escapement was, but you knew what the bell meant. And more importantly, you knew what was expected of you when it sounded. This is where the clock's real power began, not in its machinery, but in how people changed their behavior around it. In a medieval town, sound carried authority. Bells already played a central role in daily life. Church bells called you to prayer, warned of fire, announced deaths, and celebrated festivals. The mechanical clock did not introduce bells, it reorganized them. Instead of ringing only in response to events, bells now rang because time itself had advanced. This subtle shift mattered. You might be a baker, rising before dawn to prepare bread. Before the clock, you judged your start time by habit and light. Now the bell told you when morning officially began. If you were late, others could hear it. If you opened too early, you were out of step with the town. Guilds, associations of craftsmen that regulated trades, were especially quick to adopt clock time. They used bells to mark the start and end of the working day. This protected workers from excessively long hours, but it also imposed discipline. Time became something you owed. If you were an apprentice, your day was now structured more tightly than ever before. Work began at the bell. Meals followed a schedule. Curfews were enforced by sound rather than sight. The clock did not care if you were tired, sick, or distracted. It moved forward regardless. This introduced a new kind of pressure into ordinary life. At the same time, clocks created a shared experience of time. Everyone in the town heard the same bell. Everyone adjusted together. This reinforced a sense of collective rhythm. You were no longer just living according to your own household's habits, but according to the town's invisible timetable. Cities like Florence and London became laboratories for this new relationship with time. Market hours were regulated. Legal proceedings were scheduled. Public labor projects like road repairs or wall maintenance were organized around the clock. This was not always welcomed. Some people resisted. Farmers on the outskirts of towns continued to work by daylight. Rural life changed more slowly. Even within cities, older residents sometimes ignored the bells, relying instead on habit and experience. But resistance was difficult when penalties were involved. Fines for missing work hours or breaking curfew became more enforceable once time was standardized. The clock made rules measurable. Meanwhile, clockmakers themselves became important figures. Building and maintaining a mechanical clock required specialized knowledge. Gears had to be shaped by hand. Iron components had to be fitted precisely. Weights had to be calibrated. This was not mass production. Each clock was a custom machine. Clockmakers were often itinerant, moving from town to town to install or repair mechanisms. They brought knowledge with them, spreading improvements slowly across regions. Over time, clocks became more reliable. Adjustments were refined. Escapements improved. Still, clocks were not yet precise enough to show minutes. Most had only an hour strike. This suited medieval needs. The goal was regularity, not precision. An hour was a broad unit useful for organizing life, but not yet slicing it finely. And yet, even this coarse division began to reshape how people thought. Once time could be counted, it could be counted against you. This had implications for labor. Payment by the day gradually gave way to payment by the hour in some trades. This encouraged closer monitoring of work. Supervisors listened for bells. Workers watched the tower. Time became a resource to be managed. Religious life changed too. Monasteries had always structured their days carefully, but mechanical clocks intensified this discipline. Prayer times became less flexible. Night offices could be observed more consistently. Some monks worried that reliance on machines weakened spiritual attentiveness. Others believed it honored God through order. The debate reflected a larger tension. Was mechanical time a reflection of divine order, or a human imposition on a world meant to remain fluid? Scholars discuss this in abstract terms, but ordinary people felt it in practical ways. You felt it when you hurried to meet a bell. You felt it when work ended abruptly, even if daylight remained. You felt it when the town gate closed at a fixed hour, regardless of your circumstances. Over time, clocks gained faces. This was another turning point. Early clock faces were simple, often showing only the hours. Numbers were large and bold, designed to be read from a distance. Hands moved slowly. Watching a clock was not yet a nervous habit, it was an occasional reference. But the visual presence of time changed its relationship to space. Time was no longer just heard, It was seen. You could look up and know where you stood in the day. This visual time reinforced authority. A tower clock looming over a marketplace reminded everyone that time was no longer personal. It was communal and regulated. In some towns, disputes arose over whose time the clock should follow. Should it align with solar noon? Should it favor merchant schedules? Should church authorities control it? These arguments may sound abstract, but they reflected real power struggles. Controlling time meant controlling behavior. One famous example comes from Milan, where civic authorities and religious institutions competed for influence over public clocks. The placement of a clock tower, the timing of bells, and the authority to adjust the mechanism were all politically charged decisions. Time was becoming governance. Even so, most medieval people did not experience this change as dramatic. It seeped into life slowly. You learned to expect the bell. You planned around it without thinking much about why. Children grew up with it. What had once been strange became normal. This is how revolutions often work, not with noise and resistance, but with routine. By the end of the 14th century, Europe was a continent listening to machines. Not constantly, not obsessively, but reliably. Time had become something that could be trusted to move forward evenly, whether or not the sun cooperated. And yet something was still missing. Clocks regulated communities, but they did not yet regulate individuals. You could hear the bell, but you could not carry time with you. Personal timekeeping, portable, precise, intimate, was still centuries away. For now, time belonged to towers and towns, not to pockets or wrists. As mechanical clocks grew more reliable and more widespread, a new question quietly emerged, one that medieval people did not yet fully articulate, but felt in their daily adjustments. If time can be divided, enforced, and shared by machines, what happens when it becomes even smaller, even more precise, and even more personal? By the 15th century, the bell no longer felt new. You had grown up with it. You expected it. Its absence would have felt unsettling, like a silence where something essential should be. The mechanical clock had settled into medieval life so completely that few people questioned its presence anymore. It was simply part of how the world worked. And that, perhaps, was its greatest achievement. At this stage, clocks were still large, public, and imperfect, but they were dependable enough to shape habits that no longer needed enforcement. People woke, worked, prayed, traded, and rested according to the rhythm the machine set. Even when you were not consciously listening for the bell, you carried its pattern inside you. This internalization of time marked a turning point. Earlier generations had responded to time as an external condition, light, weather, season. Now you responded to it as an expectation. You felt early or late. You felt ahead or behind. These were not physical states, they were mental ones. The clock had begun to live inside people's thoughts. Technologically, clocks continued to evolve. Improvements in gear ratios and escapements made them more stable. Maintenance routines became standardized. Towns budgeted for clock repairs. Some even kept written records of adjustments, treating timekeeping as a civic responsibility. Clock towers grew taller and more ornate. Faces became more decorative. In some cities, clocks displayed not only hours, but astronomical information, phases of the moon, feast days, zodiac signs. Time was being linked to cosmic order, reinforcing the idea that mechanical regularity reflected a deeper truth about the universe. But beneath this symbolism, something practical was happening. Time was becoming scarce. As trade expanded across Europe, coordination mattered more. Merchants relied on predictable schedules. Ships departed at set times. Market days were regulated more strictly. Delays had consequences. Missing a bell could mean missing an opportunity. This is where the language of time began to change. You could now waste time. You could save it. You could lose it. These metaphors were not yet fully developed, but their roots were forming. Once time could be counted, it could be valued, and once it was valued, it could be judged. For laborers, this judgment was increasingly tangible. Employers monitored hours more closely. Bells marked not just beginnings and endings, but compliance. If you worked slowly, you were not just inefficient, you were out of sync with time itself. This shift did not immediately lead to modern time discipline, but it laid the groundwork. The clock normalized the idea that time was something external, fixed, and indifferent to individual needs. Religious thinkers noticed this change. Some welcomed it as evidence of divine order. Others worried it encouraged pride and control. If humans could regulate time so precisely, did they risk forgetting their dependence on God? These debates echoed quietly through sermons and treatises, but everyday life continued regardless. Meanwhile, a crucial development was approaching, one that would eventually complete the clock's transformation from communal authority to personal companion. Smaller clocks were being experimented with. Early attempts at portable timekeeping were clumsy and unreliable, but the idea itself was revolutionary. To carry time with you, to consult it privately, without a tower or bell, would fundamentally alter your relationship with the day. That future was not yet fully realized in the medieval period, but the mechanical clock had made it imaginable. By the late 1400s, Europe was a place where time no longer flowed unnoticed. It was measured, shared, regulated, and expected. Children grew up learning its structure. Adults planned around it. Communities enforced it. The medieval clock did not simply prepare the way for modern schedules, it changed how people understood their own lives. Life could now be divided into units. Progress could be measured. Delays could be blamed. And perhaps most importantly, the clock introduced the idea that time was not infinite in its flexibility. It moved forward at its own pace, whether you were ready or not. This idea would later underpin industrial labor, scientific experimentation, global navigation, and modern economics. But it began here, quietly, with iron gears turning in stone towers, ringing bells that asked nothing except obedience. As you imagine yourself standing in a medieval square at dusk, hearing the final bell of the day, you might reflect on how natural it now feels to organize your life around hours and minutes, despite the fact that, not so long ago, time was something far looser, softer, and less demanding. The mechanical clock did not just tell medieval people what time it was. It taught them what time meant. And once that lesson was learned, history could never quite forget it. Story 2. Seeing clearly at last, the invention of eyeglasses. Imagine that nothing in your world is designed to help you see more clearly. Not because people are cruel or careless, but because the problem itself has not yet been solved. Words fade as you age. Fine details soften. Thread slips from your fingers. Letters on a page blur into one another. And there is no remedy, only adaptation, resignation, or quiet withdrawal from tasks that once defined your place in the world. For most of medieval history, this was simply how aging worked. If you were born with poor eyesight, or if your vision deteriorated over time, as it almost always did, you adjusted as best you could. You memorized texts instead of reading them. You relied on apprentices, children, or younger colleagues. You shifted from skilled manual work to supervision or instruction. Eventually, many people accepted that certain kinds of work were no longer available to them. This was not considered tragic, it was expected. Medieval society did not imagine that the human body could be corrected in this way. Illness might be treated, injury might be bandaged, but gradual decline, that was fate. And yet, quietly, in workshops and scriptoria, the problem of failing eyesight was becoming harder to ignore. This was a world increasingly filled with small, precise tasks. Manuscripts were copied by hand. Contracts were written and examined closely. Accounts were kept. Legal systems relied on documents. Religious life depended on reading, chanting, and interpreting texts. The written word was gaining weight. If you were a scribe, a monk, a notary, or a merchant, your eyes were your livelihood. By the early 13th century, Europe was experiencing what historians sometimes call a reading revolution. Literacy was expanding beyond monasteries. Universities were forming. Books, while still expensive, were becoming more common. The demand for written material grew steadily. And with it, the frustration of blurred vision. Presbyopia, the age-related difficulty of focusing on close objects, affects almost everyone eventually. Medieval people did not know the term, but they knew the experience. Arms grew too short to hold text at a readable distance. Candles were brought closer. Letters were rewritten larger. Light was blamed. Fatigue was blamed. Age was blamed. But the underlying optical problem remained unsolved. Some early attempts were made. Polished crystals or glass spheres had long been used as burning lenses or decorative objects. Ancient writers like Seneca had noted that glass could magnify text when placed over it. But these observations were not yet turned into practical tools for everyday use. That changed in northern Italy. By the late 1200s, artisans in places like Florence and Venice were already highly skilled in glassmaking. Venetian glass, in particular, was famous for its clarity. At the same time, Italian cities were centers of commerce, law, and scholarship fields that demanded close reading. Somewhere at the intersection of these needs and skills, a simple but profound idea emerged. What if shaped glass could compensate for aging eyes? The earliest eyeglasses were astonishingly modest. They did not rest on the ears. They had no arms. They consisted of two convex lenses mounted in frames designed to be held to the face or balanced on the nose. They were awkward. They slipped easily. They required practice to use. But they worked. For someone struggling to read, the experience must have felt almost miraculous. Letters sharpened, lines separated, text returned. The invention spread quickly, even though its origins remain obscure. No single inventor can be confidently credited. Later traditions named figures such as Salvino degli Armati, but modern historians treat these claims cautiously. What matters more is the environment in which eyeglasses appeared, a culture that increasingly depended on close visual work and had the technical means to experiment with optics. One of the earliest written references to eyeglasses comes from a sermon delivered in 1306 by a Dominican friar in Pisa, who mentioned the recent invention of spectacles for the eyes. The tone was practical, not amazed. That alone tells you something. The device had already entered common use among certain groups. You would not have seen eyeglasses everywhere. They were expensive and specialized, but among scholars, clergy, and merchants, they spread steadily. To own a pair was to extend your productive life. This had quiet but significant consequences. In a world without eyeglasses, intellectual authority often belonged to the young. When eyesight failed, participation faded. With eyeglasses, older individuals could continue reading, writing, and teaching. Experience remained active. Memory was reinforced by text. Authority lasted longer. This subtly altered the balance of knowledge. Universities benefited. Legal institutions benefited. Religious orders benefited. Anyone whose work relied on documents benefited. Eyeglasses did not create literacy, but they supported it. They allowed accumulated knowledge to remain accessible. And yet, eyeglasses were not seen as a medical device in the modern sense. They were tools, craft objects sold by peddlers and artisans. Quality varied widely. Lenses were not standardized. Choosing the right pair involved trial and error. If you were buying eyeglasses in the 14th century, you might test several pairs, holding them to a page until the text seemed clearest. There was no prescription, no optometrist, just experience and adjustment. Still, the concept itself was revolutionary. that a physical limitation could be compensated for by technology. This idea would eventually underpin countless later inventions, but here, in its earliest form, it was intimate and quiet. No bells rang, no towers were built. The change happened at desks, by candlelight, in the slow turning of pages. As eyeglasses spread, they also carried social meaning. Wearing them marked you as a reader, a thinker, a professional. In art, eyeglasses became symbols of learning and age. They signaled seriousness, not weakness. This mattered in a culture that valued visible signs of authority. And yet, despite their usefulness, eyeglasses raised questions. Did they interfere with natural order? Were they indulgent? Some moralists worried that reliance on such aids encouraged vanity or dependence. Others dismissed these concerns. If a tool allowed you to serve God or society more effectively, why reject it? The debate never became loud. The benefits were too practical. By the end of the medieval period, eyeglasses were firmly established in European life. They did not transform society overnight, but they quietly extended working lives, preserved skills, and made the written word more accessible to those who might otherwise have lost it. Still, much remained unresolved. Eyeglasses helped with close vision, but distance vision was another matter. Lens quality was inconsistent, optical theory was incomplete, and the social implications of correcting the body with technology were only beginning to unfold. As you imagine yourself leaning over a manuscript, holding a pair of heavy glass lenses to your eyes, you might wonder, once people accept that technology can correct human limitations, where does that logic eventually lead? Once you had used eyeglasses, it was difficult to forget what they revealed. The return of clarity was not dramatic in the way a miracle story might describe it. There was no sudden flood of light, no overwhelming emotion. Instead, there was a quiet relief. Letters stopped swimming. Lines of text held together. Your eyes no longer ached as quickly. Reading became possible again, not effortless but manageable. And because the change was subtle, it invited reflection rather than awe. You might wonder why glass helped at all. Medieval people did not fully understand optics, but they were not ignorant either. Scholars had inherited fragments of ancient Greek and Arabic optical theory, much of it preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars centuries earlier. Light, vision, and perception were topics of serious study. One of the most influential medieval thinkers on vision was Roger Bacon, who wrote extensively about lenses, refraction, and the potential of optical aids. He believed that properly shaped glass could improve human sight and even extend human capability. His ideas were theoretical, but they reflected a growing confidence that nature followed knowable rules. Eyeglasses fit neatly into this worldview. They were not magic, they were shaped matter interacting with light. Still, there was hesitation. Eyeglasses required trust in a material that distorted as much as it clarified. Early lenses were far from perfect. Glass contained bubbles and impurities. Grinding techniques were inconsistent. Two lenses that looked identical could behave very differently. Using eyeglasses meant accepting that what you saw was mediated by an object. This raised subtle philosophical questions. Was the image you saw through glass true, or was it an illusion? Did corrected vision represent reality more accurately or less? Most people resolved these questions pragmatically. If the words were clearer and the work could continue, that was enough. But the acceptance of eyeglasses also depended on social reinforcement. You were more likely to trust them if respected figures used them. Scholars, preachers, and officials who wore spectacles normalized their presence. Over time, eyeglasses became associated not with frailty, but with seriousness and authority. In paintings and manuscript illustrations from the 14th century onward, eyeglasses often appear on the faces of elders, judges, and learned men. They signaled wisdom acquired over time and the tools needed to preserve it. This symbolism mattered. Medieval society valued continuity. Knowledge was transmitted slowly, through apprenticeship, teaching, and repetition. Anything that allowed experienced individuals to remain active contributors strengthened that chain. Eyeglasses did exactly that. They also subtly altered education. University study involved long hours of reading and commentary. Students strained their eyes. Teachers relied on texts. With eyeglasses, both groups could work longer and more comfortably. This may seem minor, but over decades it accumulated. More reading meant more comparison of texts, more marginal notes, more careful argument. The technology did not create scholarship, but it supported its expansion. Eyeglasses also traveled. Peddlers sold them across regions. Italian craftsmen exported them northward. By the late medieval period, spectacles were known throughout Europe. Local variations emerged, but the basic design remained similar. Still, eyeglasses were limited. They addressed one specific problem: difficulty seeing close objects. Nearsightedness, farsightedness, and other visual impairments were not yet well understood or corrected. Lens types were not classified. There was no systematic way to match lenses to individual needs. If you had poor distance vision, eyeglasses might not help you at all. This limitation meant that eyeglasses did not yet reshape navigation, warfare, or large-scale observation. Their impact remained concentrated in textual and close-detail work. But within that domain, their influence was steady and deep. Another consequence was economic. Eyeglasses were valuable objects. They required skilled labor and quality materials. Owning a pair signaled access to resources. This reinforced existing social divisions. Those who could afford eyeglasses could continue working longer. Those who could not often could not. In this way, eyeglasses quietly extended inequality alongside productivity. Yet even here, the story is not purely negative. Over time, as glassmaking improved and production increased, prices gradually fell. Eyeglasses became more accessible. What began as a specialized tool slowly edged toward broader use. Culturally, eyeglasses also encouraged a new attitude toward the body. They suggested that decline was not always final, that tools could intervene. This did not lead medieval people to reject aging or mortality, but it softened their boundaries. If eyesight could be helped, what else might be? This question did not yet produce immediate answers, but it lingered. Eyeglasses became part of a growing collection of technologies alongside clocks, improved tools, and architectural innovations that hinted at a future shaped by human ingenuity rather than acceptance alone. By the end of the 14th century, eyeglasses were no longer remarkable. They were expected in certain settings. A scribe without them might be pitied. A scholar who refused them might be seen as stubborn. The glass had earned its place. And yet, much remained unresolved. Optical theory was still incomplete. Lens making was still inconsistent. And the idea of correcting vision raised deeper questions about perception itself. If glass could alter what you saw, how confident could you be in your senses? And if human experience could be improved through tools, where did the natural body end and technology begin? As you rest your eyes on a page made legible by curved glass, you might find yourself wondering whether this small invention is simply a convenience or the first step toward a much larger redefinition of what it means to be human. By the time you reached old age in the 15th century, there was a quiet possibility your grandparents never had. You might still be useful, not simply respected for memory or experience, but actively involved reading, writing, correcting, teaching, accounting, interpreting. The blurring of letters no longer had to mark the end of your participation in the written world. With a small frame of glass balanced on your nose, your eyes could keep pace with your mind. This change did not announce itself with ceremony. There were no proclamations, no institutions formed around it, but its effects spread steadily, like ink soaking into parchment. One of the most important consequences of eyeglasses was time. They extended it. Not life itself, but productive life. Years that might once have been marked by withdrawal could now be filled with continued work. A notary could draft contracts into his 60s. A monk could continue copying manuscripts long after his eyesight should have failed. A teacher could keep lecturing, reading glosses, and correcting student work. In medieval society, where expertise was accumulated slowly and passed on through direct contact, this mattered deeply. Knowledge did not renew itself quickly. Losing experienced readers meant losing stability. Eyeglasses reduced that loss. They also altered how knowledge was preserved. Older scholars were better positioned to compare texts, notice errors, and comment critically. Marginal notes multiplied. Corrections accumulated. Intellectual traditions became denser, more layered. This was not innovation in the dramatic sense, but it was consolidation. And consolidation is what allows future breakthroughs to stand. There was another, less obvious effect: patience. Reading without eyeglasses when vision is failing is exhausting. With them, it becomes sustainable. Longer reading sessions became possible. Deeper engagement followed. Texts were not merely skimmed or memorized, they were examined. This shift quietly prepared Europe for an event that would soon test the limits of human vision and endurance. The printing press. When Johannes Gutenberg introduced movable type printing in the mid-15th century, he did not invent reading, but he multiplied it. Books became more numerous, more standardized, and more widely available. The amount of text in circulation increased dramatically. Without eyeglasses, this explosion of print would have been far less usable. Printed books were dense, fonts were small, pages were packed with information. Reading became a more intense visual task than ever before. Eyeglasses made this possible for a much wider range of people, especially older scholars, clergy, and officials who formed the backbone of early print culture. In this way, eyeglasses and printing reinforced each other. One extended the supply of text, the other extended the ability to consume it. Together, they accelerated literacy, learning, and record-keeping. And yet, even as eyeglasses became more common, they remained imperfect. Lenses were still handmade. Optical errors were common. Some glasses caused headaches or distortion. Users learned to tolerate flaws because the alternative was worse. This tolerance is important to understand. Medieval people did not expect perfection from technology. They expected usefulness. Eyeglasses were judged not by how ideal they were, but by whether they allowed work to continue. That pragmatic attitude helped them spread. Eyeglasses also subtly reshaped how people thought about the body. The medieval worldview emphasized acceptance of aging, weakness, limitation. Eyeglasses did not overturn this philosophy, but they complicated it. They suggested that decline was not always final, that assistance was not always indulgence. The body could be supported. This idea would later expand dramatically, but in the medieval period it remained modest and restrained. Eyeglasses did not promise youth. They promised continuity. And that promise was powerful. By the end of the 15th century, eyeglasses were no longer experimental. They were embedded in professional life. They appeared in wills. They were repaired, resold, and inherited. They had become ordinary. That ordinariness is their true legacy. Eyeglasses did not reshape battlefields or redraw borders. They did not announce a new age. Instead, they quietly kept people at their desks. They preserved attention. They extended concentration. They made it possible for history to be recorded by those who had lived it longest. As you imagine yourself closing a book at the end of a long day, lifting heavy lenses from your nose, you might reflect on how much of what survives from the past depended on someone being able to see clearly just a little longer. And you might wonder how different history would look if those small frames of glass had never existed. Story 3. Turning wind into work, medieval windmills and invisible power. Before you ever thought of wind as power, you thought of it as inconvenience. It pushed rain sideways into your face. It flattened crops just before harvest. It rattled shutters, creaked roofs, and made travel unpleasant. Wind was unpredictable, invisible, and indifferent to your plans. You could feel it, hear it, and curse it, but you could not command it. For most of human history, that was enough. Medieval people were already familiar with power derived from muscle, human and animal, and from water. Watermills had existed for centuries, quietly turning streams into motion. They were reliable, steady, and understandable. Water followed channels. Gravity did the rest. Wind was different. It came and went. It changed direction. It refused schedules. Depending on it seemed risky, even foolish. And yet, in parts of medieval Europe, people began to do exactly that. Not because they were bold visionaries, but because they had little choice. If you lived in a flat, marshy region with slow-moving rivers, water power was unreliable. Streams did not fall fast enough. Seasonal flooding disrupted channels. In some places, water simply was not available in useful form. But wind was. In coastal and lowland areas, particularly around the North Sea, wind was a constant presence. It swept across open land and shallow water with little obstruction. It was already shaping the environment. The question became whether it could also be put to work. The earliest known windmills appeared not in Europe, but in Persia, where vertical-axis windmills were used as early as the 9th century. These designs used sails mounted around a vertical shaft, enclosed within walls that directed airflow. They were suited to consistent desert winds and specific local conditions. Europe, however, developed its own solution. By the late 10th or early 11th century, horizontal-axis windmills began appearing in parts of northern Europe. These are the windmills you are more likely to recognize. Tall structures with rotating sails facing into the wind. Their emergence was not sudden, and their exact origin is still debated. What is clear is that by the 12th century, windmills were spreading steadily across regions like Flanders, England, and parts of northern France. These early windmills were crude by later standards. Many were post-mill structures built around a single vertical post, allowing the entire body of the mill to be turned by hand to face the wind. This alone tells you something important. Wind power required attention. Unlike watermills, which could run continuously with minimal adjustment, windmills demanded constant human involvement. Someone had to judge the wind's direction and strength. Someone had to rotate the mill. Someone had to decide when conditions were too dangerous to operate. This made wind power feel less like a machine and more like a negotiation. If you were a miller operating a windmill, your day began with observation. You watched the sky, you felt the air, you listened. The mill did not simply run, it had to be coaxed. And yet, when it worked remarkably well. Windmills could grind grain just as effectively as watermills. They could be built where watermills could not. They did not require dams, channels, or rights to waterways. They used a resource that belonged to no one and everyone at once. This last point mattered. In medieval society, control of water was often tied to power. Lords claimed rights to rivers and mills. Peasants were required to use a lord's mill and pay for the privilege. Watermills reinforced feudal control. Windmills complicated this system. Because wind could not be owned in the same way, windmills sometimes offered more flexibility. This did not mean they were free from regulation, far from it, but their presence introduced alternatives. In some regions, communities pooled resources to build windmills. In others, landlords adapted, incorporating wind power into existing systems of control. Either way, something had changed. The windmill represented a new kind of relationship with nature. It did not redirect or contain a force, as a dam did with water. It intercepted it. It borrowed motion without stopping the wind itself. This required a conceptual shift. You had to believe that an invisible force could be reliable enough to power daily work. You had to accept variability and still plan around it. This was not intuitive. Medieval people valued predictability. Windmills challenged that preference. At first, their use was limited. Watermills remained dominant where conditions allowed. But in regions where water was unreliable or land was flat, windmills proved their worth. Grain had to be ground. Flour had to be produced. Bread was the foundation of diet. Any technology that made this process more flexible mattered. Over time, windmill design improved. Sails were adjusted to catch wind more efficiently. Gearing systems became more robust. Millers developed rules of thumb practical knowledge passed down through apprenticeship about how to operate safely and effectively. This knowledge was local and embodied. It was not written in treatises. It lived in habits and experience. Windmills also changed landscapes. They were tall and visible, often placed on hills or open fields. They became landmarks. You could see them from a distance, their sails turning slowly against the sky. They signaled industry, preparation, and presence. In a flat landscape, a windmill announced human intention. But these structures were also vulnerable. Storms could destroy them. Lightning strikes were a constant risk. Repairs were frequent. Operating a windmill meant accepting loss as part of the process. This acceptance shaped attitudes toward risk. Medieval people were accustomed to uncertainty, but windmills formalized it. You invested labor and materials into a machine that might sit idle for days or be damaged overnight. You balanced potential gain against unpredictable conditions. This mindset would later prove essential in other forms of economic activity. At this early stage, however, windmills were still primarily agricultural tools. They ground grain. They did one thing repeatedly. Their broader potential had not yet been realized. But even in this limited role, they hinted at something new. They showed that power did not have to come from muscle or flowing water. It could come from the environment itself, harnessed indirectly. This idea would later expand dramatically, but here, it remained grounded in daily necessity. As you imagine yourself standing near an early windmill, watching its sails creak and turn, you might feel a mix of skepticism and hope. Will the wind hold? Will the grain be ground today? Will the machine survive the season? And you might begin to wonder, once people accept that invisible forces can be harnessed for work, how far does that idea eventually travel? Once the windmill proved that it could work at all, a more complicated question followed. Who controlled it? This was not a technical question. It was a social one. In medieval Europe, technology rarely existed outside systems of power, obligation, and ownership. A windmill might look like a simple structure turning in the breeze, but beneath it lay contracts, customs, and conflicts that shaped daily life just as much as the machinery itself. If you lived in a village, the mill mattered. Grain could not be eaten as it was harvested. It had to be ground. Bread depended on it. Control of milling was control of survival. For centuries, this control had belonged largely to lords through watermills. Peasants were often required to use a specific mill and pay a fee. This arrangement was enforced by law and custom. It generated steady income for landowners and ensured oversight of food production. Windmills unsettled this balance. They did not require a river. They could be built on open land, sometimes at the edge of settlements. In regions where watermills were impractical, windmills offered an alternative that was harder to monopolize completely. This did not mean they were free from control, but it did mean the rules had to be renegotiated. In parts of the Low Countries, particularly areas that would later become the Netherlands. Windmills multiplied rapidly. The flat landscape, steady winds, and limited elevation made water power unreliable but wind power abundant. Here, windmills became common features of the countryside. Some were owned by lords, others were managed by towns. A few were built cooperatively by villagers. Each arrangement reflected local conditions and power structures. Disputes followed. Could a peasant build a windmill on common land? Did the wind passing over a lord's estate belong to him? Could a watermill owner demand compensation for lost business when a windmill appeared nearby? Medieval law did not have ready answers. Wind was not easily categorized. It crossed boundaries without regard for ownership. This forced communities to improvise. In some regions, new regulations emerged. Windmill placement was restricted. Licenses were required. Fees were imposed. In others, informal arrangements prevailed, negotiated through custom rather than written law. These negotiations mattered because windmills were not cheap. Building one required timber, iron fittings, skilled labor, and time. Maintenance was ongoing. Storm damage was common. Investing in a windmill meant accepting uncertainty not just from the weather, but from neighbors and authorities. If you were a miller, you needed both mechanical skill and social awareness. You had to know when to operate, when to stop, and whom to appease. Despite these challenges, windmills spread. They spread because they solved problems that watermills could not. They spread because grain still needed grinding when rivers froze or dried up. They spread because population growth increased demand for food processing. And they spread because people learned to manage their risks. Windmill design evolved in response to these pressures. Post mills, which required the entire structure to be turned by hand, were gradually supplemented by more stable designs. In some regions, millers added protective features to reduce storm damage. Sail cloth could be adjusted or removed in high winds. Experience taught caution. This practical knowledge was not written down. It lived in routines. It was passed from master to apprentice. It was shaped by failure as much as success. Windmills also began to take on new functions. While grain grinding remained primary, some mills were adapted for other tasks, pressing oil from seeds, sawing wood, or powering simple machinery. These experiments were limited, but they hinted at broader possibilities. The idea that wind could power more than one kind of work was beginning to take root. At the same time, windmills reshaped landscapes in visible ways. They required open space. Trees were cleared. Hills were preferred. Paths formed around them as people traveled to and from the mill. Villages oriented themselves around these structures. A windmill was not just a machine, it was a focal point. It also became a symbol. In art and literature, windmills began to represent labor, persistence, and adaptation. They were not romanticized in the medieval period, but they were recognized as markers of human effort against environmental uncertainty. You could see them from far away, turning steadily or standing still. Both states meant something. Turning meant productivity. Stillness meant waiting. This waiting was an accepted part of life. Unlike later industrial machines, windmills did not promise constant output. They promised opportunity. When conditions were right, work could be done efficiently. When they were not, you waited. This taught patience. It also encouraged planning. Grain might be stored longer. Milling schedules were adjusted. Communities learned to buffer uncertainty rather than eliminate it. This mindset would later prove essential in economic systems far beyond agriculture. By the mid-14th century, windmills were firmly established in northern Europe. They had not replaced watermills, but they had complemented them. Together, they formed a more resilient system of power, one that drew on multiple natural forces. And yet, the full implications of wind power were still unrealized. Windmills were still local. Their output was limited. Their mechanisms were relatively simple. No one yet imagined landscapes filled with machines transforming energy on a massive scale. But the conceptual leap had been made. People had accepted that an invisible, unpredictable force could be harnessed for routine work. They had learned to build around variability rather than resist it. They had negotiated new forms of ownership and risk. These lessons would not stay confined to wind. As you picture yourself walking across open fields, watching a line of windmills turning unevenly under a shifting sky, you might begin to sense that something more than grain is being processed here. You might wonder whether this quiet partnership with the air is merely a solution to local problems, or the early rehearsal for a world increasingly powered by forces no one can see. By the late medieval period, the windmill no longer felt experimental. It stood where it had stood for generations, repaired and rebuilt as needed, its form familiar against the horizon. Children grew up watching its sails turn. Millers inherited not just machinery, but habits, ways of reading the sky, listening to the wind, and knowing when to act. The windmill had settled into life. And in doing so, it had taught a lesson that extended far beyond agriculture. Windmills required restraint. If the wind was too strong, the mill had to be stopped. If it shifted suddenly, adjustments were necessary. Pushing the machine beyond its limits risked destruction. Operating a windmill meant recognizing that more power was not always better. This was a different philosophy from that of watermills, which thrived on steady flow and rewarded containment and control. Windmills rewarded responsiveness. They demanded attentiveness rather than dominance. This distinction mattered. As medieval society grew more complex, the ability to manage variability became increasingly valuable. Markets fluctuated, harvests failed, plagues arrived without warning. Certainty was rare. The windmill, with its cycles of activity and waiting, mirrored this reality. It normalized uncertainty. Technically, windmills continued to improve. New designs increased efficiency and durability. In some regions, millers experimented with fixed towers and rotating caps, reducing the labor required to orient the sails. Gearing systems became more reliable. These changes were incremental, but they reduced risk and labor. Still, the basic relationship remained the same. The wind could not be commanded. This acceptance influenced how people thought about energy more broadly. Power was not always something you generated, it was something you intercepted when conditions allowed. This idea would later reappear in technologies like sailing ships, water management systems, and eventually even modern renewable energy. But in the medieval period, it remained grounded in daily routine. Windmills also contributed to economic resilience. By supplementing water power, they reduced dependence on a single energy source. When rivers froze or dried, windmills could operate. When wind failed, watermills took over. This redundancy supported population growth and urbanization. It also encouraged specialization. Millers became skilled operators of complex machines. Carpenters and blacksmiths found steady work building and maintaining mills. Knowledge circulated along trade routes as designs and techniques spread. In this way, windmills supported networks of labor and expertise. They also shaped mental maps. Travelers navigated by them. Villages identified themselves by them. Legal documents referenced them. A windmill anchored space as well as function. By the 15th century, windmills were doing more than grinding grain. In some regions, they powered sawmills, aiding in timber processing. Elsewhere, they assisted in drainage, lifting water from low-lying land. These applications were still limited, but they hinted at a broader future. Particularly in the Low Countries, windmills would later become essential to land reclamation, reshaping geography itself. But even before this large-scale transformation, The principle was clear. Wind could do more than turn stones. And yet, medieval people did not frame this as progress. They saw windmills as solutions to specific problems, not steps toward a new age. There was no ideology of innovation driving their spread. There was only need, observation, and adaptation. This is what makes windmills so instructive. They were not imposed from above by grand planners. They emerged from local conditions. They succeeded because they fit the environment and the social structures around them. They also failed often. Mills collapsed, sales tore, investments were lost, but failure was absorbed into practice. Repairs followed, adjustments were made. Over time, this cycle built confidence not in perfection, but in resilience. By the end of the medieval period, windmills had quietly transformed how people thought about work, energy, and uncertainty. They had shown that power could come from sources beyond muscle and water. They had taught patience, adaptability, and attentiveness. And perhaps most importantly, they had made the invisible useful. As you imagine yourself pausing on a country road, watching a windmill sail slow and stop as the air falls still, you might reflect on how natural it feels to wait, how acceptable it seems to let the machine rest until conditions improve. In that moment, you are seeing a medieval lesson that still applies today. Not all progress comes from forcing the world to comply. Sometimes, it comes from learning when to move and when to stand still. Story 4. The heavy plow and the slow conquest of Northern Europe's soil. If you tried to farm the land of Northern Europe using Mediterranean tools, the land pushed back. Not metaphorically, physically. The soil was different here, thicker, wetter, heavier. In large parts of what is now Northern Europe, the ground was packed with clay, tangled with roots and soaked by frequent rain. When you drove a light scratch plow into it, the blade barely cut. Instead of turning the earth, it dragged through it, leaving shallow grooves that filled quickly with water. Seeds planted there struggled, crops failed more often, labor was wasted. For centuries, this limited how land could be used and how many people it could support. Farming in these regions required patience, endurance, and a willingness to accept poor yields. In many areas, forests remained uncleared not because people lacked ambition, but because the soil beneath them resisted older methods of cultivation. This resistance shaped settlement. Communities clustered where lighter soils were available along river valleys, sandy plains, or previously cultivated land. Large tracts of fertile-looking earth remained unused because they were simply too difficult to work. If you lived in these regions before the heavy plow, farming was a struggle against the ground itself. The tools available were not inadequate in general, they were just unsuited to this environment. The light plow, effective in the dry soils of the Mediterranean, skimmed the surface. It loosened earth but did not invert it. In clay-rich soil, this meant weeds survived, water pooled, and nutrients remained unevenly distributed. The land demanded something stronger. But inventing that solution was not straightforward. A heavier tool meant more resistance. More resistance meant more power. More power required more animals, better harnessing, and stronger materials. This is why the heavy plow did not appear all at once. It emerged gradually, as a system rather than a single invention. By the early medieval period, several developments were quietly aligning. Ironworking had improved, making stronger blades possible. Oxen were increasingly used for traction. Fields were being reorganized. Communities were experimenting not out of curiosity, but necessity. Somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries, a new kind of plow began to appear in Northern Europe. It was heavier. It had a vertical cutting blade known as a coulter that sliced into the soil ahead of the plowshare. It had a mold board that turned the soil over completely, burying weeds and exposing fresh earth. Instead of scratching the surface, it reshaped it. This was the heavy plow. Using it was not easy. It required coordination. Teams of oxen, often 8 or more, were needed to pull it through dense soil. The plow itself was large and difficult to maneuver. Turning at the end of a field took time and effort. But the results were unmistakable. The soil was properly aerated, drainage improved, weeds were buried, crops grew more reliably. Land that had once resisted cultivation began to yield. This changed how fields were laid out. Because the heavy plow worked best in long, straight lines, fields became elongated strips. Turning the plow was costly in time and energy, so farmers minimized it. This led to the characteristic open field system seen across much of northern Europe, long strips farmed by different households, aligned side by side. The tool shaped the landscape. It also shaped social organization. Because the heavy plow required many animals, individual families often could not operate it alone. Cooperation became necessary. Oxen were pooled. Labor was shared. Villages coordinated plowing schedules. This fostered interdependence. If you lived in such a village, your farming success depended not only on your own effort, but on collective planning. Disputes over animals, timing, and land use became more common and more consequential. The heavy plow did not just increase productivity, it demanded structure. It also encouraged expansion. Once heavy soils could be worked reliably, forests were cleared, new settlements formed, marginal lands became viable, population slowly increased, supported by more consistent harvests. This process was uneven and slow. Failures still occurred, weather still mattered, but the balance had shifted. Humans were no longer adapting entirely to the land, they were reshaping it. Importantly, this reshaping was not seen as conquest. It was seen as survival. The heavy plow spread gradually across regions like Frankish Empire and later into areas of what would become Germany and England. Its adoption varied depending on local conditions, resources, and traditions. Some communities resisted it not out of conservatism, but because the investment was high and the risks real. A broken plow or a lost ox could be disastrous. Still, where it took hold, the heavy plow transformed agriculture. It made dense soils productive. It supported larger populations. It altered settlement patterns that would last for centuries. And yet this transformation came with costs. Heavier plowing disturbed ecosystems. Forest clearance changed local climates. Soil erosion increased in some areas. The land yielded more, but it also demanded more management. These consequences were not fully understood at the time. Medieval farmers judged success by harvests, not by long-term sustainability. The heavy plow solved immediate problems and created new ones that would unfold slowly. For now, what mattered was that the land could finally be worked. As you imagine yourself behind a team of oxen, guiding a heavy plow through thick, resistant soil, you might feel the strain in your arms and back, and the satisfaction of seeing the earth turn cleanly for the first time. You might also wonder whether this tool is simply an improvement on older methods, or the beginning of a deeper transformation, one that ties people, animals, tools, and land into a system that cannot easily be undone. Once the heavy plow proved it could turn dense soil, the work did not become easier, it became more social. The plow was large, and the oxen required to pull it were more than any single family could manage alone. In practice, operating one meant cooperation, pooling animals, sharing labor, and coordinating schedules. Villages became more than collections of households. They became systems of interdependence centered on agriculture. If you lived in a village with a heavy plow, your day was not only about driving oxen or guiding a blade. You had to negotiate with neighbors. Who would supply animals this week? Who would take turns with plowing? How would you divide the profits or harvest? Decisions were collective, sometimes tense, and almost always binding in practice. This cooperative aspect extended beyond plowing. Maintaining a heavy plow required blacksmithing, carpentry, and repair work. Oxen needed harnesses, shoes, and care. Fields required drainage ditches, boundary markers, and fences. Each improvement demanded labor, coordination, and shared knowledge. The heavy plow reshaped not just soil, but social life. Villages began to formalize systems of obligation. Medieval documents from the Low Countries and northern Germany show that families were assigned strips of land to cultivate using shared oxen teams. Rules governed who could access animals, when work should start, and how harvests were allocated. These arrangements strengthened communal bonds while also creating points of conflict when resources were scarce. Even local lords took notice. Some lords encouraged plowsharing arrangements because more productive fields meant more rents and tithes. Others attempted to monopolize plowing resources, claiming oxen, tools, or labor. The balance between village autonomy and feudal authority often shifted, and the heavy plow became a focal point for negotiation, dispute, and compromise. Economically, the impact was profound. Heavier soil could now produce reliable yields. Villages once constrained by infertile land expanded. Settlements moved into previously forested or marshy regions. Food surpluses increased, supporting larger populations. Markets became more stable, and trade in grain and livestock grew. Villages could feed more people, which in turn allowed for more craftsmen, clerics, and minor nobility. The heavy plow also changed rhythms of labor. Because the tool required significant energy and preparation, plowing became a seasonal and collective activity. Villagers planned carefully. Time for plowing, sowing, and harvest had to align with weather, soil conditions, and labor availability. Delays could be costly. Mismanagement could damage soil or overwork oxen. Efficiency required coordination, foresight, and patience. At the same time, the heavy plow demanded technical knowledge. Millennia of simple plowing habits no longer sufficed. You needed to know the soil's behavior, the blade's angle, the oxen's response. Turning corners, avoiding damage to the plowshare, and preventing the moldboard from clogging were learned through experience. Knowledge was embodied and local. It could not be fully captured in words. This combination of technical skill and social coordination made the heavy plow a bridge between technology and community. It also reinforced hierarchy. Not every family could contribute oxen or skilled labor equally. Households with resources gained influence. Villagers with experience operating plows became leaders in agricultural planning. Those who could not participate fully were dependent on others, sometimes for survival. Power shifted subtly alongside technology. Culturally, the heavy plow began to influence perceptions of human dominion over nature. Previously, much of northern Europe's land seemed unconquerable. Forests, wetlands, and dense clay soils were obstacles. The heavy plow did not remove all challenges, but it allowed humans to impose order and productivity on land that had resisted cultivation for generations. The relationship between people and soil became more active, more intentional. And yet challenges remained. Weather could ruin plowing plans. Oxen could fall sick. Plows could break. Floods or frost could undo weeks of effort. Every season, communities had to negotiate risk, effort, and reward. Success was not guaranteed. Through this uncertainty, villagers learned patience, adaptability, and resilience. They learned that progress was incremental. They learned that tools amplified effort, but did not eliminate the need for judgment and cooperation. As you imagine standing at the edge of a freshly plowed field, watching oxen strain under the yoke and neighbors coordinate the next strip, you might notice how the act of cultivating the soil has become a shared rhythm, a human system embedded in natural resistance. And you might begin to ask, if a simple but well-adapted tool can reshape communities, productivity, and social structures, what other, invisible, forces of technology might quietly transform life without anyone fully realizing it? By the 13th century, the heavy plow had done more than just turn soil, it had begun to turn society itself. Where the land had once dictated limits, human ingenuity now pushed boundaries. Forests fell slowly but steadily. Marshes were drained with ditches and rudimentary sluices. Villages expanded into previously marginal territory. The soil, once an obstacle, had become an instrument of growth. This transformation was neither quick nor uniform. In some regions, soil stubbornly resisted even the heaviest plow. Yields were inconsistent. Labor shortages, animal illness, and equipment failure could undo months of work. But where perseverance met opportunity, the results were profound. Fields that once produced little now yielded enough to feed larger populations, sustain surplus trade, and support artisanal industries. The heavy plow also reinforced communal cooperation. Villages organized labor, coordinated schedules, and developed local rules for sharing oxen, maintaining tools, and distributing harvests. Social cohesion was strengthened not through imposed authority alone, but through practical interdependence. Survival demanded collaboration, and the plow facilitated it. At the same time, technological improvements continued. Plows were reinforced with stronger iron shares. Moldboards were refined to reduce resistance and improve soil turnover. Harnessing techniques for oxen improved, allowing for more efficient use of animal power. These incremental innovations accumulated over generations, enhancing productivity and resilience. The impact on landscape and settlement was unmistakable. The open field system became the dominant method in northern Europe. Fields were divided into long strips, cultivated collectively or rotated among families. Villages were organized around these fields, with roads, commons, and grazing lands integrated into the system. The heavy plow had shaped not just soil, but human geography. Economically, the heavy plow created new possibilities. Surplus grain could now be stored, traded, and transported to towns. Markets became more reliable. Population growth was supported. Craft production, clerical work, and trade expanded as fewer hands were required for subsistence farming. The ability to sustain larger populations laid the groundwork for later urbanization. Culturally, the plow reinforced a sense of mastery over nature. Where previously the environment had defined limits, technology had begun to extend them. Human ingenuity was recognized as a mediator between stubborn soil and survival. The heavy plow symbolized both the persistence and patience required to turn challenge into opportunity. Yet challenges remained. Fields eroded, floods damaged crops, and heavy labor remained taxing. Social hierarchies were reinforced. Those with oxen, tools, and knowledge gained influence. Those without were dependent. Progress was never evenly distributed. Still, the broader lesson endured. The heavy plow was not merely a tool, it was a system. It integrated technology, human effort, social coordination, and environmental understanding. Its slow but steady influence reshaped northern Europe, enabling the growth of villages, the spread of agriculture, and the eventual support of larger populations and urban centers. As you stand on a plowed field in the late medieval period, feeling the furrows turned by oxen and guided by skilled hands, you might reflect on the quiet power of a well-adapted tool. It does not force history at once. It works incrementally, embedding itself into social, economic, and environmental systems until change becomes inevitable. And you might wonder, if a single tool could gradually reshape land, society, and life itself, how many other forces of human ingenuity are quietly rewriting history while we fail to notice them? Story 5. The medieval compass and the opening of the world. Before the compass, the world was a vast and uncertain place. If you were a sailor navigating the North Sea, the Mediterranean, or the Atlantic coast, your life depended on the wind, the stars, and your own memory. Clouds could hide familiar landmarks. Fog could erase the horizon. Currents and tides could shift unexpectedly. A miscalculation of distance or direction could strand you on a foreign shore or sink you at sea. Maps existed, but they were crude and incomplete. Charts were often regional, showing only known coasts. Inland rivers and coastal hazards might be documented locally, but anything beyond familiar routes was speculation. Sailing blind into unknown waters was an act of both courage and desperation. Even within familiar waters, navigation was difficult. Coastal navigation relied on landmarks, birds, and cloud patterns. Seasonal winds were noted carefully, often through oral tradition passed among sailors. Pilots kept mental logs of currents and tides. Experience mattered more than theory, but when weather obscured these cues, mistakes became inevitable. And mistakes could be deadly. The sea was unforgiving. A ship driven off course could miss a harbor entirely. Food and water ran out. Storms struck without warning. Even experienced sailors faced limits. Each journey carried risk, and survival was never guaranteed. This uncertainty shaped medieval trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. Merchants and sailors often traveled short distances, sticking to familiar routes because the unknown was too dangerous. The world beyond sight was not only distant, it was unpredictable and threatening. Into this world of uncertainty, the magnetic compass arrived. The earliest European references to the compass date from the late 12th century, though knowledge of the device likely came from China via Arab intermediaries. Early compasses consisted of a magnetized needle balanced on a pivot or floated in water, aligning itself with the magnetic north-south axis. For the first time, sailors could determine direction without relying solely on observation. The change was subtle at first. Compass needles were not perfectly reliable. Early instruments lacked stable pivots. Magnetic variation differences between magnetic north and true north was not yet understood. Still, the ability to identify a general direction without landmarks was revolutionary. Sailors began to incorporate compasses into their routines. Even an imperfect compass reduced uncertainty. Journeys could be planned more reliably. Routes could be extended beyond immediate sight of land. Mariners could return to familiar ports with more confidence, even under overcast skies. The compass also reshaped how distance and direction were conceptualized. Previously, navigation relied on estimation. How long the wind had blown, how far currents carried the ship, or how long it took to reach a visible landmark. The compass introduced orientation as a quantifiable measure. North, south, east, and west became practical tools, not merely abstract ideas. This shift influenced not only navigation, but trade and exploration. Ports could anticipate arrivals. Merchants could estimate shipping times with greater accuracy. Regions previously isolated could be linked through maritime networks. Knowledge of the wider world became more manageable. The adoption of the compass was uneven. Some sailors clung to traditional methods, trusting experience over tools. Others embraced the device cautiously, testing it against familiar landmarks and refining techniques. Manuals for pilotage gradually included compass readings alongside observations of stars, winds, and currents. The compass also had symbolic impact. To use it was to assert a measure of control over an unpredictable environment. Sailors were no longer entirely at the mercy of nature. The device represented human ingenuity mediating between fear and necessity. Its presence on a ship conveyed competence, confidence, and preparation. And yet, even with the compass, uncertainty remained. Storms could still drive ships off course. Magnetic variation could mislead. Mistakes in measurement or calculation were common. The compass was a guide, not a guarantee. As you imagine yourself at the prow of a medieval ship, needle balanced on a pivot, horizon lost in fog, you might feel a fragile sense of confidence. You are still vulnerable, but you now have a tool that extends your reach. that allows you to imagine a course beyond what you can see. And you might wonder, if a small piece of magnetized iron can change how people understand and navigate the world, what other invisible forces lie waiting to reshape our perception of distance, direction, and possibility? Once sailors began using the compass, a subtle transformation took place not in the sea itself, but in how humans related to it. Previously, navigating beyond sight of land was a gamble. You relied on memory, intuition, and observation. You read the clouds, the color of the water, the flight patterns of birds. You measured distance by the hours the sun had traveled across the sky, or by the rhythm of the waves. Each observation required skill, attentiveness, and constant judgment. And yet, even the most experienced sailors sometimes failed. A sudden fog or an unexpected storm could erase all certainty. The compass changed that dynamic. Even a crude needle offered a reference that did not shift with clouds or tides. By pointing toward magnetic north, it gave direction when all else was obscured. It did not guarantee safety, but it allowed sailors to plan. It allowed them to steer consistently rather than drift aimlessly. This was not immediate. Early European compasses were often rudimentary, a simple magnetized needle mounted on a piece of wood, sometimes floated in a bowl of water to reduce friction. Errors were common, and magnetic variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north, was not yet understood. Sailors had to learn to interpret the needle cautiously, checking it against familiar landmarks and stellar observations. Despite imperfections, the compass slowly gained trust. Manuals and pilot guides began to incorporate it alongside traditional methods, giving instructions for courses between ports and the use of bearings to measure direction. Coastal pilots, particularly in the Mediterranean, experimented with combining compass readings and dead reckoning, keeping track of speed and time to estimate positions. Knowledge became cumulative, grounded both in observation and in the new instrument. The compass also reshaped maritime economies. With more reliable orientation, ships could venture farther from familiar coasts. Trade networks extended, linking distant ports. Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa benefited tremendously. Merchants could schedule shipments with greater confidence. Markets became more predictable, and regions previously considered marginal for trade became accessible. Even culturally, the compass left its mark. Maps evolved. Mariners began to use grids and bearings in nautical charts, reflecting the way the needle oriented them in real space. Concepts of cardinal directions became practical tools rather than abstract notions. The world began to feel more knowable, more navigable, even if dangerous. Yet the compass did not make voyages safe, it merely reduced uncertainty. Storms, currents, and human error still claimed ships. Sailors still relied on skill, instinct, and the observation of nature. The needle was a partner, not a replacement. It demanded attention, maintenance, and interpretation. Using a compass effectively meant understanding its limitations as well as its guidance. The adoption of the compass also introduced subtle social effects. Those who could read and use it effectively gained prestige among crews. Masters and pilots who trusted the needle could make decisions with authority, guiding ships along routes that others might have avoided. Navigation became increasingly professionalized. Experience alone was no longer enough. The skilled use of instruments mattered. Even its symbolism mattered. The compass represented human ingenuity mediating uncertainty. To hold a needle in hand was to assert, however modestly, mastery over the invisible forces of the earth. Wind, waves, and fog remained powerful, but the compass gave orientation. It allowed projection, planning, and calculation. It made exploration conceivable in ways that mere observation had never achieved. And yet, for all its practical benefits, the compass raised questions. Sailors noticed that needles sometimes wavered. Magnetic anomalies, often caused by iron deposits or storms, could mislead. Dependence on the instrument demanded new forms of judgment. The very tool that reduced uncertainty also required vigilance, adaptability, and skepticism. As you imagine yourself on the deck of a medieval cog, needle balanced carefully, fog surrounding the hull, horizon vanished, you might feel the fragile confidence it provides. The world has opened a little, yet it remains vast, unpredictable, and challenging. You are no longer completely at the mercy of what you can see, but you are still subject to what you cannot. And you might begin to wonder, once humans learned to trust invisible forces like magnetism, what other unseen powers might they harness to extend their reach, reshape their understanding, and alter the course of history? By the 15th century, the compass had moved from novelty to necessity. Sailors no longer relied solely on memory, landmarks, or the stars. The needle, a small, magnetized piece of iron, was now a trusted companion, silently indicating direction even in fog, overcast skies, or unfamiliar waters. It did not remove risk, but it reframed it. A ship that once could drift unknowingly off course now had a chance to maintain a deliberate bearing, to chart a course that extended human presence beyond familiar coasts. This small instrument quietly reshaped exploration. Maritime voyages grew longer, trade routes extended. Coastal cities such as Lisbon and Seville began sending ships farther along the Atlantic, reaching new ports and islands previously beyond practical reach. The compass allowed the development of routes that were less dependent on the winds, stars, or sight of land. Sailors could venture into open seas with a confidence previously unimaginable. The compass also contributed to a revolution in map-making. Cartographers began to represent directions consistently, using grids of north, south, east, and west. Portolan charts, with their intricate networks of rhumb lines radiating from compass points, became essential tools for navigation. The world, while still largely unknown, became more knowable in principle. Distances could be estimated, positions plotted, and voyages planned with greater precision. Technological refinement accompanied this adoption. Compass needles became standardized. Pivots improved. Early compasses evolved from floating needles in water to needles mounted on pins or gimbals for stability at sea. Sailors learned to correct for magnetic declination, even if imperfectly. Instrumental literacy became part of maritime skill, complementing experience with observation. Yet for all its practicality, the compass demanded respect. It did not eliminate uncertainty. Storms, unpredictable currents, human error, and rudimentary charts could still doom a voyage. But it offered a framework, orientation, planning, and a measure of control. The needle was an interface between human intention and natural forces, a tangible guide to navigating the invisible world. This had profound social and economic implications. Merchants and states could envision longer voyages with reduced risk, opening access to distant trade goods and wealth. Cities could plan for supplies and taxation with greater certainty. Knowledge of the wider world became actionable, not merely theoretical. The compass, in effect, multiplied the reach of medieval Europe. It also reshaped how people imagined space. Previously, the unknown seas were vast and intimidating. With a compass, they became a domain that could be traversed, studied, and mapped. The instrument expanded not only physical horizons but conceptual ones. Humans began to think in terms of global connectivity rather than isolated regions. The world, once unmanageable, started to feel navigable. Still, the compass remained a tool of subtle power. It required skill, attention, and judgment. Dependence on it demanded responsibility. A misreading could be disastrous. Sailors had to interpret its guidance alongside currents, winds, and stars. Trust in the needle was cautious, conditional, and always mediated by experience. And yet, this humble instrument set the stage for exploration on a scale previously unimaginable. It allowed voyages into the Atlantic, the exploration of new coastlines, and eventually the crossing to continents unknown to Europe. By granting orientation, it extended human agency across spaces that had long been forbidding. As you imagine yourself steering a medieval caravel across an open sea, compass in hand, horizon obscured, waves rising and falling. You may feel both small and empowered. You are still subject to the immense forces of nature, but you now possess a tool that converts invisible magnetic force into actionable knowledge, a bridge between uncertainty and mastery. In that sense, the compass represents more than navigation. It embodies the beginning of a new mindset, that invisible forces, if understood and respected, can be harnessed to extend human reach, reshape economies, and ultimately rewrite the perception of the world itself. And you might wonder, if a simple magnetized needle could open the oceans to human exploration, what other hidden forces are waiting to transform the way we perceive and interact with the world? Story 6. The Astrolabe and the Mathematics of the Sky. Before the astrolabe, the sky was both familiar and unknowable. You could recognize constellations, predict seasons, and track the passage of time, but only approximately. You read the heavens with a mixture of observation, oral tradition, and simple tools. Night and day, solstice and equinox were known, but their precise measurement was elusive. Sailors, astronomers, and scholars relied on memory, rough instruments, and tables compiled over centuries. Even simple tasks, finding the time at night, predicting the rising of a star, or determining latitude at sea, were fraught with uncertainty. Into this world entered the astrolabe, a disc of brass or wood engraved with markings for stars, circles, and degrees. It was a calculating device, a model of the sky compressed onto a manageable object. You could hold it in your hand, sight along it, rotate it, and through it measure angles, positions, and time. Suddenly, the heavens became tangible, manipulable, and predictable in ways that had previously required either years of study or extraordinary luck. The astrolabe did not appear suddenly in Europe. Its origins trace back to Hellenistic Greece, refined and preserved by Islamic scholars in the Middle East, especially during the Abbasid period. By the 12th and 13th centuries, knowledge of the instrument had spread into Spain, Italy, and France through trade, translation, and scholarship. European students and astronomers began crafting their own, often elaborate, versions. Its uses were diverse. In astronomy, it allowed measurement of the altitude of stars above the horizon. In navigation, it provided a means, albeit still limited, to estimate latitude at sea. In religious practice, it helped determine prayer times and the direction of Mecca for scholars familiar with Islamic applications. It also served educational and philosophical purposes, offering a microcosmic model of the universe that could be held, rotated, and explored. Operating an astrolabe demanded training. You needed to know the star chart, understand the relationship between angles and positions, and interpret the results correctly. A novice could take measurements but misread them. A skilled user could calculate time, date, and latitude with remarkable precision. In essence, the device converted knowledge into action. Observation became calculation. The sky became data. This transformation affected daily life in subtle ways. Scholars could predict celestial events, plan agricultural activity, and standardize calendars. Sailors could attempt navigation beyond coastal waters with a guide for latitude, even if longitude remained elusive. Communities could coordinate religious observances more precisely. Knowledge, once diffuse and approximate, became structured and measurable. The astrolabe also influenced how people imagined the cosmos. By compressing the heavens into a tangible object, it encouraged thinking about space in a systematic, mathematical way. Stars, planets, and horizons could be plotted and rotated. The world became modelable, predictable, and to a degree, controllable. This was not a complete mastery. The heavens still held mysteries, but it allowed humans to engage with them more confidently. And yet, for all its sophistication, the astrolabe was imperfect. Its precision was limited by craftsmanship. Observations were constrained by weather, geography, and human error. Measurements could be approximate rather than exact. Its utility at sea was constrained by movement and instability of the ship. Despite these limitations, the instrument represented a leap forward. It enabled humans to interact with the cosmos systematically and reproducibly. As you imagine holding a medieval astrolabe under the night sky, aligning its pointers with stars, rotating its disks, and reading angles inscribed in brass, you feel a quiet thrill. Here is a machine that condenses centuries of observation into a single object, a bridge between human perception and the heavens themselves. And you might wonder, if humans can compress the complexity of the sky into a handheld instrument, what other unseen structures, natural, mathematical, or otherwise, could be rendered tangible, measured, and mastered in ways that reshape understanding and action? Once the astrolabe became familiar in European scholarly and navigational circles, it quietly changed how people approach both learning and the world. Before its introduction, knowledge of the heavens was dispersed across generations of observation, oral teaching, and rudimentary instruments. You could estimate time at night, predict certain seasonal events, and read approximate positions of stars. But precision was elusive. The sky, while observed faithfully, remained largely an arena of approximation, intuition, and sometimes superstition. The astrolabe offered a bridge between experience and calculation. By rotating the reedy and overlay representing stars against the fixed plate marked for latitude, users could determine the altitude of celestial bodies above the horizon. From this, time, date, and even geographic position could be inferred. What had once been an act of intuition became, with careful observation, an act of measurement. This was not immediate mastery. Operating an astrolabe required training, patience, and repetition. Each measurement depended on careful alignment, steady hands, and a clear sky. Observers learned to interpret readings, correct for local latitude, and understand the subtleties of apparent star motion. Errors could mislead, but over time, users internalized the principles. The instrument taught discipline and attentiveness, as well as a new way to relate abstract calculations to observable reality. The applications were wide-ranging. In navigation, mariners began to extend coastal travel into open waters. By measuring the altitude of the pole star or other known stars, a sailor could roughly estimate latitude. Coastal pilots in the Mediterranean and later in the Atlantic began combining compass and astrolabe readings to plan longer voyages. This allowed trade routes to extend further, merchants to connect more distant ports, and the scope of human movement to grow. In astronomy, the astrolabe offered scholars a model for the heavens that was manipulable and calculable. Star charts could be referenced against a rotating disk. Predictions of celestial events became possible and more reliable. Observers could compare measurements, verify them against calculations, and refine both instruments and methods over generations. Knowledge became cumulative, documented, and increasingly precise. The astrolabe also influenced culture and education. Its complexity made it a symbol of scholarly achievement. Students in cathedral schools and universities practiced using it as part of mathematical and astronomical training. It became a hands-on representation of the mathematical order of the universe, a portable model of cosmic structure. Possessing and understanding an astrolabe was both practical and prestigious, a mark of intellectual competence. Yet even as it spread, limitations persisted. Early European astrolabes were often calibrated for specific latitudes. Accuracy depended on craftsmanship and careful measurement. Clouds, weather, and even the tremor of a ship at sea could compromise readings. It was a guide, not an infallible oracle. Users had to combine observation, calculation, and judgment. In doing so, they developed a new skill set, interpreting instruments, assessing error, and negotiating uncertainty. The broader lesson extended beyond astronomy or navigation. The astrolabe taught that complex systems, whether stars, trade networks, or ecosystems, could be modeled, measured, and understood incrementally. It introduced the idea that unseen patterns could be rendered tangible and used for practical decision-making. Its influence was subtle, diffuse, and long-lasting. Imagine holding the brass disc in your hands, aligning the reedy with a star, rotating the pointer, reading angles and slowly calculating time or position. You feel the weight of accumulated knowledge in your fingers, the observations of generations, preserved and concentrated in a single instrument. It is at once precise and delicate, demanding care, attention, and patience. And as you look up at the night sky, you realize the world has changed. The heavens, once distant and unknowable, can now be measured, modeled, and understood. Humans have begun to interact systematically with forces far beyond ordinary perception. And you might wonder, if a simple instrument can make the vastness of the sky navigable and measurable, how much else in the world hidden, complex, or seemingly beyond reach could be made tangible through careful observation, mathematics, and ingenuity? By the late 15th century, the astrolabe had firmly established itself as a cornerstone of medieval scientific and navigational practice. What began as a curious instrument for scholars and mariners had matured into a tool that subtly reshaped the European understanding of the world and of humanity's place within it. In practical terms, the astrolabe had expanded horizons. Mariners could travel farther with greater confidence. By measuring the altitude of stars and interpreting the readings alongside latitude-specific plates, sailors navigated coastal waters and, increasingly, open seas. While longitude remained elusive, latitude allowed for consistent courses, safer voyages, and longer trading expeditions. Mediterranean ports, Atlantic harbors, and emerging trade hubs benefited as the instrument enabled more reliable connections across regions. At the same time, the astrolabe reshaped intellectual life. Scholars began to view the cosmos as a structured, measurable system rather than a collection of unconnected phenomena. The instrument compressed the complexities of the heavens into a manageable, manipulable model. By rotating the reedy, aligning it with the horizon, and reading angles, users transformed the sky into data. Mathematics became the language of observation, linking celestial motion with human comprehension. This was revolutionary in its subtlety. The world itself had not changed, but the human ability to model, predict, and plan based on celestial phenomena had expanded. The astrolabe created a framework in which invisible forces, the apparent motion of stars, the passage of time, the cycle of seasons could be observed, calculated, and utilized in daily life. Knowledge, previously dispersed, became portable, measurable, and actionable. Culturally, the astrolabe also carried symbolic weight. Ownership and mastery of the instrument signaled education, precision, and authority. A scholar who could calculate prayer times, predict solstices, or determine latitude impressed peers and patrons alike. Mariners who could navigate with it gained trust and prestige among their crews. The instrument bridged intellectual, practical, and social realms, demonstrating the power of applied knowledge. Its limitations, however, remained a constant teacher. Accuracy depended on craftsmanship, latitude-specific calibration, and clear skis. Observers had to interpret results carefully, correct for error, and integrate readings with other knowledge. The astrolabe demanded both rigor and judgment. Mastery was never automatic. It required practice, attentiveness, and repeated verification. Yet within these constraints lay a profound lesson. The astrolabe demonstrated that even complex, seemingly inaccessible systems could be rendered understandable through ingenuity, observation, and careful abstraction. It showed that the invisible could be represented, the vast made manageable, and the uncertain made partially predictable. In essence, it taught humans to measure, interpret, and interact with forces that once seemed beyond comprehension. By the end of the 15th century, the astrolabe's influence extended beyond astronomy and navigation. Its principles informed early cartography, timekeeping, and mathematical education. It fostered a mindset that valued measurement, calculation, and systematic observation, a mindset that would underpin the Renaissance and the later age of exploration. Without it, sailors might have continued to rely on memory and stars alone. Scholars might have lacked the practical framework to link theory with observable phenomena. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit study or on the deck of a ship at night, the astrolabe in your hands, ready aligned with the stars, angles measured and noted. Each reading connects you to centuries of accumulated knowledge, to observers long gone, to patterns invisible to the naked eye. You hold both the tool and the understanding. It embodies the human capacity to make sense of the immense and the remote. In that quiet moment, the astrolabe is more than a measuring device. It is a teacher of patience, precision, and humility. It is a reminder that understanding requires observation, calculation, and careful attention. And it is a testament to the medieval imagination, the belief that the universe, though vast and complex, could be modeled, explored, and gradually made intelligible. And you might wonder, if a single instrument can transform perception, skill, and possibility, what other unseen systems, forces, patterns, or structures await discovery, ready to reshape the way humans navigate both the world and knowledge itself? Story 7. Medieval Eyeglasses and the Vision of Knowledge. Before eyeglasses, aging, poor eyesight, or vision defects were an almost invisible barrier to knowledge. Scholars, monks, and scribes often worked by candlelight, copying manuscripts, reading theological texts, or performing calculations by hand. Over time, the eyes failed. Letters blurred, ink smudged, and pages became indecipherable. Many were forced to stop working long before their minds or abilities were spent. In medieval Europe, literacy and scholarship were concentrated in monastic and urban centers. Monks in scriptoriums spent hours reproducing texts, often in small, cramped rooms with uneven lighting. Students in cathedral schools or universities studied by flickering candles or daylight streaming through high windows. In such conditions, even minor vision problems could drastically limit productivity and learning. Eyeglasses, first appearing in northern Italy around the late 13th century, offered a solution. Crafted from small convex lenses mounted in frames or holders, these early spectacles magnified the letters on the page, bringing blurred text into clarity. They were crude by modern standards, heavy, fragile, and uncomfortable, but they addressed a critical need, extending the working life of those whose eyesight was failing. The invention did not appear overnight. Lens making was difficult. Grinding glass to precise curves required skill and patience. Convex lenses were initially used to correct farsightedness, suitable for reading close text. The frames were simple two lenses connected, often by rivets or held by hand, perched precariously on the nose. Despite their rudimentary design, these devices fundamentally altered the relationship between humans and written knowledge. Eyeglasses were rare and expensive at first. Only those with access to wealth, education, and skilled craftsmen could afford them. Monks, university scholars, and urban professionals were the primary beneficiaries. For them, the glasses extended intellectual productivity, allowing aging scholars to continue copying manuscripts, analyzing texts, and teaching students. The impact on scholarship, though subtle, was significant. The social implications were immediate. Knowledge became more portable across time. A monk with failing eyesight could continue working, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost. Students and clerics could study longer, reducing the generational gaps in learning. Eyeglasses enabled continuity, bridging physical limitations with intellectual ambition. Yet adoption was gradual. Many were skeptical of these small glass devices. They seemed unnatural, fragile, and cumbersome. Early eyeglasses were primarily stationary tools, used while seated over manuscripts. There were no hinges or temples like modern glasses, so mobility was limited. Still, their advantages were undeniable. Blurred letters sharpened, fatigue reduced, and work extended. The invention of eyeglasses subtly redefined human interaction with knowledge. Before them, physical limitations curtailed intellectual potential. After them, the body could be augmented to maintain mental output. Scholars began to see that tools could compensate for natural decline, creating the first small step toward what we now call assistive technology. Imagine yourself in a medieval scriptorium, candlelight flickering over parchment, your eyes straining to discern the tiny script. A pair of simple lenses rests on your nose. The letters sharpen. Words that once swam in a blur now resolve. Hours of labor no longer threaten complete fatigue. You realize that a simple piece of curved glass has restored a bridge between your mind and the written world. And you might wonder, if a small lens can extend human vision, and with it, access to knowledge, what other unseen limitations are waiting to be overcome by ingenuity, altering not just capability but the course of intellectual history? By the mid-14th century, eyeglasses were beginning to diffuse beyond the rarefied spaces of monasteries and universities, though they remained a luxury. For scholars, clerics, and scribes, they represented more than an optical device. They were a tool of empowerment. Where aging eyes once curtailed productivity, vision correction allowed extended engagement with texts, calculations, and observation. The practical effects were transformative. Scribes could copy more pages with fewer errors. Scholars could study longer hours without succumbing to the fatigue and strain that had previously limited their output. Students in the growing universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford could read from distant blackboards or fine manuscript illuminations with greater clarity. Knowledge became less tethered to the physical frailty of the human eye. Eyeglasses also introduced new social and intellectual dynamics. The ability to read longer and more accurately conferred advantage. Experienced scholars could continue producing work that influenced generations, while younger students could access clearer guidance. The glasses subtly reinforced hierarchy. Vision, once a private limitation, could now be partially equalized through technology, but only for those who could afford it. The design and production of eyeglasses continued to evolve. Craftsmen experimented with frame materials, lens shapes, and methods of holding the lenses in place. By the late 14th century, primitive riveted frames allowed some adjustment and minimal stability. Some were mounted on long handles, meant to be held in place for reading, while others rested precariously on the nose. Though cumbersome, these innovations increased usability and comfort, allowing extended study and work. The broader impact was not limited to reading alone. Eyeglasses indirectly enhanced other fields requiring precision and observation. Artists could discern finer detail in manuscript illumination. Architects and surveyors could measure and draw more accurately. Physicians could study texts and diagrams with improved clarity. The enhancement of vision enabled better transmission of knowledge, more precise craft, and incremental progress across multiple disciplines. Yet limitations persisted. Early lenses corrected mainly farsightedness, leaving those with nearsightedness still disadvantaged. Glass was fragile, expensive, and prone to scratches. The curvature of lenses was rudimentary, and optical theory was in its infancy, so results were approximate. Users had to learn to align the lenses correctly, adjusting their position and angle for maximum clarity. Even with these constraints, the gains were unmistakable. The social perception of eyeglasses shifted as well. Initially met with skepticism, sometimes associated with vanity, eccentricity, or even suspicion of unnatural enhancement, glasses gradually became a mark of intellect and diligence. To wear them was to declare engagement with scholarship, to assert commitment to learning, and to signal capability despite physical limitation. In essence, eyeglasses altered the relationship between the human body and the acquisition of knowledge. Where once physical decline limited mental productivity, a simple technological intervention extended capacity. This was an early recognition that human capability could be augmented, that tools could compensate for biological constraints. The innovation was small, often overlooked, yet its impact on intellectual history was profound. Imagine yourself sitting at a dimly lit desk, parchment spread before you, a pair of small convex lenses perched on your nose. Letters that previously blurred now form distinct, readable shapes. Calculations, theological arguments, or passages of classical philosophy become accessible again. The effort of seeing the barrier between knowledge and perception is partially removed. Each page you read represents not just information absorbed, but time and intellect preserved. And you might wonder, if a simple pair of lenses can restore vision and prolong intellectual life, what other human limitations, physical, cognitive, or environmental, could be overcome by small innovations, quietly reshaping the trajectory of learning, labor, and understanding? By the late 15th century, eyeglasses had firmly established themselves as an indispensable tool in European intellectual life. What began as a small innovation, a pair of convex lenses mounted to assist failing eyesight, had subtly reshaped the production, preservation, and dissemination of knowledge across monasteries, universities, and cities. For scholars and scribes, the effects were immediate and profound. Aging monks could continue copying manuscripts long after their peers' eyes had failed. University professors could lecture and annotate texts with accuracy, even into old age. Students could study for longer hours, navigating the fine script of illuminated manuscripts without strain. Intellectual work was no longer strictly constrained by the fragility of human vision. The innovation also spread into the crafts and arts. Illuminators, painters, and architects benefited from enhanced precision. Minute details could be executed with greater fidelity. Measurements could be verified, calculations recorded, and designs rendered with clarity. In subtle ways, eyeglasses improved the quality of work, not just the quantity. Socially and culturally, eyeglasses signaled knowledge, diligence, and capability. Wearing them identified an individual as literate, scholarly, and serious. They became markers of authority and professionalism, transforming perceptions of competence. A scholar with clear vision could command respect not only through knowledge, but also through sustained performance over time, a performance once limited by the slow decay of eyesight. Technically, the glasses continued to evolve. Frames became more practical, with rivets, handles, or early versions of temples that improved stability. Lens-making techniques improved as artisans experimented with grinding, curvature, and materials. Even with limitations, farsighted correction only, fragility, and rudimentary design, the impact was enormous. Small, handheld devices multiplied human potential quietly and efficiently. Eyeglasses also influenced intellectual continuity. By extending the functional working life of scholars, they preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. Manuscripts that might have been left unfinished were completed. Observations, calculations, and annotations accumulated, providing a foundation for future discoveries. The simple lens, in effect, extended not just sight, but the continuity of human understanding. Yet the eyeglasses' influence was more than practical. They demonstrated a profound principle. Human limitations could be augmented with technology. The instrument encouraged a mindset that small, thoughtful innovations could compensate for biological constraints and expand capacity. It foreshadowed a future where tools could not only aid human ability, but also amplify it, reshaping work, learning, and intellectual life in ways previously unimaginable. Imagine yourself seated in a quiet study, the lenses perched on your nose, parchment in front of you. Letters that once swam into obscurity now remain clear. Calculations, texts, and diagrams are accessible. The work you can complete today is not limited by your age or failing eyes. It is extended, multiplied, preserved. Each page is a testament to ingenuity, a bridge between human fragility and human achievement. And in that quiet reflection, you might consider, if a simple pair of lenses can extend vision and preserve thought, what other unseen barriers in human life could be overcome with innovation, subtly altering the course of history, thought, and possibility itself? Story 8. Medieval mechanical clocks and the discipline of time. Before mechanical clocks, time in medieval Europe was an approximate, flowing concept. The day was divided by the sun, the church bells, or the chimes of the town. Monks followed canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, but even these divisions were flexible, adjusted according to the season and the amount of daylight. Urban towns and villages marked hours with simple sundials or water clocks, but measurement was imprecise. Time was experienced as a rhythm of life rather than a quantifiable unit. For ordinary people, daily life was shaped by natural cues. Sunrise and sunset dictated work in the fields. The crowing of roosters, the tolling of bells, or the changing patterns of sunlight structured daily routines. Time was relational, not absolute. One might rise at cockcrow, eat at midday, or begin work when the sun is high. Precision was irrelevant. Survival, labor, and ritual were guided by cycles and patterns rather than minutes. This perception began to shift in the early 13th century with the emergence of mechanical clocks. Early examples appeared in cathedral towers and civic buildings, constructed with iron gears, escapements, and weights. They were monumental devices, often several meters high, and required teams of skilled craftsmen to build and maintain. Unlike sundials or water clocks, mechanical clocks did not rely on sunlight or flowing water. They operated continuously, regardless of weather, and produced audible signals that marked hours consistently. The first clocks were primarily public devices, visible and audible across towns. Their chimes regulated civic life, opening and closing markets, regulating labor shifts, or signaling prayer times. They did not yet measure minutes or seconds accurately. Precision was still crude, but they created a shared temporal framework. Townspeople could synchronize activities, coordinate work, and plan interactions according to a consistent measure rather than individual perception or tradition. Building and maintaining these clocks demanded a new class of technical expertise. Blacksmiths, metalworkers, and engineers collaborated to craft gears, escapements, and weights. The construction of a single large tower clock could take years, requiring ingenuity, knowledge of materials, and careful observation of mechanical principles. Every adjustment affected accuracy. Every failure was public and obvious. The mechanical clock transformed knowledge of craft into a public instrument of temporal order. The social implications were subtle but profound. Time became more standardized, more regimented. Communities could plan collectively. Work could be measured, shifted, and coordinated. Bells regulated life in ways that had previously been dictated by sun, labor, and ritual. By imposing a uniform rhythm, mechanical clocks began to reshape how people conceived of the day, work, and human coordination. Yet early clocks were not perfect. They were slow, heavy, and prone to inaccuracy. Drifting gears, friction, and irregular weights meant that time remained approximate. Maintenance was constant. Nevertheless, even imperfect clocks introduced a new mindset. Time was measurable, segmentable, and consistent across space, rather than a personal, flexible experience. Imagine standing in the town square as the large iron clock tower strikes the hour. Farmers pause in their fields, merchants look to the bells, and apprentices adjust their work according to its chime. The sound communicates more than the hour. It enforces rhythm, coordination, and shared expectation. For the first time, daily life is guided not only by nature or tradition, but by a machine that mediates human action. And you might wonder, if a set of gears, weights, and levers can reshape the perception and organization of an entire community, how many other invisible structures quietly govern human behavior, waiting for the tools to make them tangible? By the 14th century, mechanical clocks were no longer rare curiosities in cathedral towers. They were slowly becoming instruments of social discipline and urban organization. The early tower clocks had taught communities that time could be regularized, measured, and externalized. People could synchronize activities not by the sun or subjective perception, but by the audible marking of hours. Markets could open simultaneously, work shifts could be coordinated, and religious observances could be more precisely timed. Life, once governed by the rhythms of nature, began to be measured against the rhythm of machinery. Technically, clockmakers refined their craft. Escapements, the mechanisms that controlled the release of energy from weights to gears, became more sophisticated, reducing irregular motion and improving accuracy. Iron and brass gears were carefully crafted to precise dimensions. Weights and counterweights regulated movement, while striking mechanisms sounded bells at consistent intervals. Each innovation required careful observation, trial, and adjustment, making clockmaking a demanding technical art. The social impact was profound. In towns with functioning tower clocks, labor became more regimented. Guilds and workshops could coordinate tasks across larger teams. Apprentices learned to pace work by hours rather than by fatigue or daylight. Civic authorities could impose schedules for public duties, curfews, and festivals. Mechanical time slowly extended into the mental and behavioral patterns of individuals. Monasteries, too, benefited from this new temporal precision. Monks could structure prayer, study, and labor with greater regularity. While the canonical hours had previously been flexible, the striking of bells from a tower clock now imposed a more uniform discipline. Life became, in part, machine-mediated. The clock acted as a collective tutor, teaching people to segment their actions, pace labor, and anticipate events. Yet the integration of mechanical time was uneven. Rural areas, where sundials and natural cues still ruled, remained largely untouched. Even in towns, clocks were imperfect and required constant maintenance. Errors were inevitable, gears wore, and adjustments were frequent. Time, though increasingly measurable, was still negotiated between human judgment and mechanical function. This interplay between human activity and mechanical regulation had unforeseen consequences. It changed perceptions of work, value, and efficiency. Labor could be measured, recorded, and coordinated. Surplus production became possible as work could be aligned more systematically. People began to think in terms of hours, shifts, and schedules rather than simply rising with the sun and stopping at night. The mechanical clock also altered symbolic conceptions of time. Whereas time had once been fluid, cyclical, and tied to nature or divine order, the clock presented it as linear, segmented, and universal within a community. Life was divided into discrete moments, each marked by the chime of the bell, a rhythm imposed from outside the human body, rather than from internal or environmental cues. Imagine standing under the shadow of a towering cathedral, the iron bells striking each hour. The sound echoes across the streets, through workshops, marketplaces, and homes. Each chime teaches rhythm, coordination, and the discipline of shared time. You feel the subtle shift. The day is no longer an unbroken continuum, but a sequence of measured intervals, each one calling for attention, action, or reflection. And you might wonder, if a machine can impose order on human perception, labor, and social interaction, what other invisible structures, social, technological, or organizational, might quietly shape how humans experience the world, long before anyone fully recognizes the change? By the late 15th century, mechanical clocks had firmly established themselves as both practical tools and social instruments, subtly transforming medieval life. Tower clocks no longer marked merely hours, they imposed a shared temporal framework that regulated labor, prayer, trade, and civic life. Time, once a flexible and largely invisible rhythm, had become measurable, public, and externalized. The technical sophistication of clocks had grown. Escapements were refined, gears carefully calibrated, and striking mechanisms tuned to sound clearly across towns. Skilled artisans maintained and repaired these machines, passing knowledge down through apprenticeships. Though still imperfect, affected by wear, weather, and gravity, they were reliable enough to standardize daily life in ways previously unimaginable. Socially, the influence of mechanical time was profound. Guilds organized work by hours rather than daylight alone. Merchants could coordinate markets and transport more efficiently. Monastic communities maintained stricter schedules, aligning labor, study, and prayer with the chimes of the tower. Individuals internalized these rhythms. Daily routines were measured, punctuality valued, and the perception of productivity shifted. Life had begun to align not only with natural cycles, but also with human-made precision. Culturally, the clock reshaped perception itself. Time was no longer solely cyclical sunrise, sunset, and seasonal patterns, but linear, segmented, and quantifiable. The day could be divided into intervals tracked and compared. The abstract became tangible. Humans could measure their lives, their labor, and their obligations in discrete units. Awareness of time became more acute, planning more exact, and coordination more achievable. This mechanization of temporal perception had long-term consequences. It fostered habits of punctuality, discipline, and planning that would influence commerce, education, and governance. Towns with clocks could manage larger populations and complex trade networks with greater efficiency. In essence, mechanical time created a social infrastructure that extended human coordination beyond the limits of memory and observation. Yet clocks remained imperfect teachers. They required maintenance, interpretation, and judgment. A misaligned gear could throw off an entire day's schedule. Bells could fail to ring, weights could break, and artisans had to constantly adjust and recalibrate. Even in their imperfection, mechanical clocks taught humility. They mediated human effort but did not replace it. Success depended on understanding the limitations of the tool as much as relying on its precision. Imagine standing in the town square as the iron bell strikes each hour. Citizens pause, merchants glance at their ledgers, apprentices adjust their tasks, and monks rise from their desks. You feel the subtle orchestration of an entire community by a simple machine of gears and weights. This rhythm is invisible yet pervasive, guiding human activity without force, demanding attention without coercion. The mechanical clock, in its quiet persistence, had achieved more than telling hours. It disciplined life, synchronized labor, and reshaped human experience. It transformed the abstract concept of time into a shared, measurable reality that structured both community and thought. It laid the groundwork for the precise, scheduled societies of the modern era, influencing commerce, governance, education, and culture. And you might wonder, if a system of gears, weights, and escapements can quietly redefine human perception, coordination, and productivity, what other hidden mechanisms, technological, social, or intellectual, are silently shaping the patterns of our lives today, waiting for recognition or refinement? Story 9. Medieval water mills and the hidden power of flow. Before water mills became common, most heavy labor in medieval Europe depended on human or animal strength. Grain was ground by hand in querns, grain mills powered by oxen turned cumbersome millstones, and lumber or textiles were cut and pounded through muscle alone. The pace of production was limited. Physical labor defined the speed and scale of survival. Water, in contrast, had always been abundant and rhythmic, yet untapped. Rivers and streams flowed continuously, their energy invisible and largely inaccessible to those who lacked tools to convert motion into work. Villages settled near water sources benefited from fish, transport, and irrigation, but harnessing flow for mechanical energy remained largely unrealized until innovations in mill construction began to appear. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the spread of water mills across Europe quietly transformed daily life. Water was captured via wooden sluices, channels, and overshot wheels. As the river turned the wheel, energy transferred to gears, axles, and millstones, performing labor previously dependent on human or animal strength. Suddenly, the labor of a dozen men or oxen could be replaced or supplemented by the flow of a single stream. The most common application was grain milling. Bread was the primary sustenance of medieval Europe, and grinding grain was both laborious and essential. A water mill allowed continuous grinding, faster processing, and greater output. Villagers could store flour for lean seasons, trade surpluses, and reduce the time devoted to grinding, freeing labor for agriculture, construction, or craft. Construction of a mill required ingenuity and collaboration. Mills were often built by local craftsmen, with wooden frameworks, gears, axles, and millstones carefully assembled. Maintenance demanded understanding of materials, where patterns and hydraulics, even if the terminology of engineering, did not yet exist. One poorly shaped gear or misaligned wheel could stop the mill entirely. The miller's skill became a critical part of local survival and prosperity. Water mills also reshaped settlement patterns. Villages often grew around rivers with mills, as milling provided both sustenance and income. Mill rights could be controlled by local lords or monasteries, creating economic hierarchies. Disputes over water access, mill operation, or fees emerged, highlighting how a single harness stream could influence social, economic, and political life. Beyond grain, water power expanded to other forms of production. Fulling mills treated cloth, sawmills cut timber, and hammers powered ironworks. Water provided a renewable, continuous source of energy that extended the reach of human labor. Industries that had once been limited by muscle or wind became viable on a larger scale. Yet challenges remained. Seasonal fluctuations could dry rivers or flood mills, wooden gears wore and stones cracked. Millers had to observe carefully, adjust sluices, and maintain equipment. Mastery of flow required patience and attention, a delicate balance between human planning and natural rhythm. Imagine standing beside a water mill in a northern European village, the wheel turning steadily as the current strikes paddles. The grinding of grain echoes in rhythm with the splash of water. You realize that unseen forces, gravity, flow, and momentum, are performing work that once required the labor of many. Human ingenuity has transformed an ordinary stream into a persistent engine, quietly powering life. And you might wonder, if harnessing a river can multiply human effort, what other natural forces, wind, heat, tides, or invisible currents, might be waiting to be shaped into tools that quietly transform society? By the 13th century, water mills had spread across Europe in impressive numbers, quietly powering a variety of industries and reshaping both the economy and daily life. The village stream, once merely a source of water and fish, had become an engine of labor, converting natural flow into mechanical energy with astonishing efficiency. Grain milling remained the primary application, but innovations expanded the scope of water power. Fulling mills processed woolen cloth by pounding it with water-powered hammers, dramatically reducing the manual labor required to clean and thicken fabrics. Sawmills cut timber with continuous motion, allowing construction projects to proceed more quickly and on a larger scale. Ironworks used water hammers to forge metal tools, nails, and weapons, accelerating production far beyond human or animal capacity. The economic impact was substantial. Villages with reliable water sources and mills gained comparative advantage. Lords or monasteries controlling the mill could extract fees or trade services, creating local wealth. Surplus production of flour, cloth, timber, or metal could be sold or exchanged, strengthening local markets and connecting communities through trade networks. Water power had become an invisible yet critical driver of economic growth. Technically, mill construction became increasingly sophisticated. Millwrights mastered the design of wheels, gears, axles, and sluices. Overshot wheels where water poured over the top maximized efficiency, using both weight and flow to turn machinery. Horizontal wheels with water striking paddles at the base were simpler but less efficient. Maintenance required constant attention. Wooden components swelled or warped with moisture, stones cracked, and sluices clogged with debris. The miller was both operator and engineer, translating the flow of water into predictable work. Water mills also influenced social structures. Villagers organized around them. Disputes over water rights became common, and ownership could shift power dynamics. Monasteries often controlled multiple mills, centralizing both economic and social authority. Towns with multiple mills developed specialized labor. Millers, millwrights, and apprentices formed a small industrial class that combined technical skill, experience, and local authority. Culturally, the presence of water power reshaped perceptions of work. Labor that had once been intensely physical, grinding, pounding, cutting, was now partially mechanized. Humans learned to collaborate with nature, observing rivers, adjusting wheels, and harnessing momentum. The mill became a symbol of ingenuity, a tangible interface between the human mind and the energy of the natural world. Yet the system was not without vulnerability. Seasonal droughts could halt production. Floods could destroy wheels or wash away sluices. Wooden mechanisms decayed, requiring regular repair. Millers had to combine observation, planning, and technical skill to keep the machinery running, negotiating the delicate balance between natural forces and human control. Imagine standing beside an overshot water wheel, watching the flow strike the paddles and turn the massive wheel steadily. Each rotation powers a millstone pounding grain into flour, while downstream a hammer pounds wool for cloth. The river itself has become a silent laborer, converting motion into human utility. You feel the quiet awe of watching invisible energy rendered visible, harnessed, and made productive. And you might wonder, if the flow of a stream can amplify human effort so dramatically, what other hidden energies, unseen currents, stored potential, or latent forces exist in the world, waiting for inventive hands to turn them into tools that change daily life, economies, and the course of history? By the 15th century, water mills had become a foundational technology across medieval Europe, quietly transforming industry, settlement patterns, and social organization. What began as the simple harnessing of a river's flow had evolved into a multifaceted system that powered flour production, cloth processing, timber cutting, and metalworking, multiplying human labor and shaping economic life in profound ways. Grain mills continued to dominate, but the expansion of fulling mills, sawmills, and hammer mills demonstrated the versatility of water power. Villages and towns with reliable streams gained economic advantage. Surplus production allowed trade beyond local markets. Resources could be processed more efficiently, and labor previously devoted to repetitive tasks was freed for agriculture, construction, and craft. Entire local economies were reorganized around the predictable energy of flowing water. Technical refinement progressed alongside expansion. Overshot wheels became increasingly efficient, channeling the weight and speed of falling water into continuous mechanical motion. Gear systems transferred energy from wheels to hammers, mills, and saws, allowing precise and repeatable work. Millwrights developed standardized techniques for maintenance, repair, and construction. Mastery of hydraulic sluices, channels, and water flow became a vital skill, ensuring mills operated even under fluctuating seasonal conditions. The social impact of water mills extended far beyond the mechanics. Mill ownership often conferred local authority. Lords or monasteries could control production, levy fees, and influence settlement patterns. Millers occupied specialized social positions, responsible for both technical operation and the fairness of grain processing. Disputes over water rights and mill operation were common, emphasizing how technology and natural resources intertwined with governance and law. Culturally, the water mill reshaped human perception of labor and nature. Work once defined by strength and endurance could now be mediated by observation, adjustment, and ingenuity. Humans learned to read rivers, monitoring flow, anticipating floods, and manipulating channels. Nature, once an unpredictable master, became a collaborator. The mill symbolized the interface of human intellect with natural forces, a quiet demonstration of how ingenuity could transform the everyday. Yet the system was delicate. Drought could halt a mill entirely, floods could destroy machinery, and wear or misalignment could disrupt output. Millers had to combine knowledge, experience, and judgment to maintain continuous production. The relationship between human and machine was reciprocal. The river provided energy, but humans had to harness it carefully, respecting its power while extracting its utility. Imagine standing beside a vast water wheel, the river turning it steadily. Downstream, a fulling mill pounds wool, a sawmill slices timber, and a grain millstone rotates rhythmically. The river itself has become a force of civilization, translating motion into work, feeding economies and sustaining communities. You feel the invisible power of water made tangible, converted into human productivity and societal growth. The water mill, in its quiet consistency, reshaped medieval life. It extended human labor, structured local economies, and facilitated technological and social complexity. Beyond mere machinery, it taught humans to observe, calculate, and collaborate with natural forces. By turning rivers into engines, medieval Europe discovered the potential of invisible energy harnessed through ingenuity, a principle that would echo into the modern industrial age. And you might wonder, if the flow of water could quietly multiply labor and reshape society, what other hidden forces, heat, wind, tides, or even invisible patterns in knowledge and trade, are waiting to be harnessed to transform the world in ways we can scarcely imagine? Story 10. Medieval Glassmaking and the Alchemy of Light. Before the medieval glassmakers refined their craft, light passed through a window as though through invisible air, softening the glow of the sun but revealing little else. Ordinary openings, wood, cloth, or animal hide, permitted light, but they could not transform it. Glass, however, allowed the medieval world to capture, bend, and manipulate illumination in ways that altered perception, aesthetics, and daily life. By the early 13th century, European glassmaking had begun to flourish, particularly in regions such as Venice, where skilled artisans refined techniques learned from Byzantine and Islamic sources. Venetian glassmakers on the island of Murano experimented with clarity, purity, and color, producing glass that could be blown, cut, or shaped into thin panes. Their skill turned raw sand, ash, and lime into a material that was transparent, reflective, and malleable. The process was both art and labor. Sand was melted in furnaces reaching over 1,200 degrees Celsius, sometimes with additives to improve clarity or prevent cracking. Molten glass was carefully blown into shapes, spun into sheets, or molded into intricate vessels. Every batch required attention. Impurities could cloud the glass, uneven heating could crack it, and even small miscalculations could ruin hours of labor. Glassmaking affected daily life in subtle but meaningful ways. Windows became possible, allowing homes, churches, and palaces to admit light while providing protection from wind and rain. Small objects, like vessels and beads, carried both aesthetic and functional value. Mirrors, initially crude and reflective only in small surfaces, allowed humans to observe themselves and their surroundings in ways previously impossible. Glass became both practical and symbolic, a material that mediated vision, light, and perception. In churches and cathedrals, glass transformed sacred spaces. Stained glass windows depicted biblical scenes, saints, and moral lessons in vibrant colors, capturing sunlight and refracting it across the stone interiors. These windows were not merely decorative, they were educational, conveying stories and values to largely illiterate congregations. The play of light through colored panes created an ethereal effect, shaping spiritual experience and enhancing the sense of awe within the sacred space. Glass also had commercial and technological applications. Scientific instruments, including lenses for eyeglasses and early astrolabes, depended on the clarity and shape of glass. Bottles, jars, and containers allowed storage of liquids and medicines, improving sanitation and preservation. Jewelry and luxury goods incorporated glass, reflecting social status, wealth, and taste. Yet the craft remained difficult and dangerous. Furnaces required constant tending, molten glass could cause severe burns, and every step from melting to shaping to cooling demanded precision. Success depended on patience, skill, and intimate understanding of materials and fire. Master glassmakers passed knowledge through apprenticeship, combining empirical observation with generational experience. Imagine standing in a workshop on Murano, the glow of the furnace reflecting off walls, artisans blowing and shaping molten glass with careful, precise movements. You feel the heat, the danger, and the transformative potential of the material. From sand and fire emerges clarity, color, and reflection, a medium that captures light and reshapes human experience. And you might wonder, if humans can manipulate sand and fire to bend light, reveal detail, and transform perception, what other hidden properties of ordinary materials await discovery, ready to expand both knowledge and the way we experience the world? By the 14th century, glassmaking in Europe had matured into both a sophisticated craft and a quiet driver of technological and cultural transformation. Once considered rare and fragile, glass began to influence everyday life, commerce, and knowledge in ways that were as subtle as they were profound. The production of window glass expanded beyond cathedrals to urban homes, town halls, and civic buildings. While early panes were small, imperfect, and uneven, artisans developed techniques to create larger, clearer sheets. Cylinder and crown glass methods, where molten glass was spun or stretched, produced panels that could admit more light while maintaining structural integrity. Interiors once dim and shadowed now filled with sunlight, revealing textures, colors, and detail that had been previously muted. Stained glass reached its peak as an intersection of art, storytelling, and education. Churches used colored glass not only for aesthetic appeal, but as a visual language for communities largely unable to read. Scenes from scripture, saints' lives, and moral allegories illuminated with changing sunlight conveyed narratives, lessons, and spiritual guidance. The interplay of fire, light, and color created an immersive experience, connecting the physical world with human imagination and devotion. Glassmaking also fed early scientific inquiry. Craftsmen produced lenses for eyeglasses, magnifying small text or symbols, allowing scholars and monks to continue their work despite failing vision. Astrolabes, telescopes later, and other instruments relied on precise glasswork to focus and bend light, translating the intangible into the measurable. By enabling detailed observation, glass extended both perception and human understanding. Commerce benefited as well. Bottles, jars, and vessels allowed the storage and transport of liquids, wine, oil, medicines, improving both trade and daily life. Glass beads and ornaments became currency in social signaling, luxury goods, and long-distance trade, particularly in northern Italian cities. Murano glassmakers developed specialized products for domestic, industrial, and artistic use, establishing a reputation that fueled both regional wealth and the transfer of technical knowledge. The craft required mastery of multiple disciplines simultaneously: chemistry, thermal physics, though unrecognized as such, geometry, and precise manual skill. Molten glass was unforgiving. Even minor impurities or sudden temperature changes could ruin a piece. Artisans learned to anticipate the behavior of materials, adjusting heat, timing, and tools instinctively. Glassmaking was at once destructive and creative, delicate and powerful, combining science and art centuries before formal theories existed. Yet glass remained a medium of fragility and limitation. Large panes were prone to cracking, mirrors reflected imperfectly, and colored glass could warp under sunlight or heat. Despite these vulnerabilities, the benefits outweighed the risks. The material extended human capability. Eyes could see better, interiors could brighten, storage and transport improved, and artistic expression reached new heights. Imagine observing a Venetian workshop, the furnace glow reflecting off molten cylinders of glass. Artisans roll, blow, and cut, transforming fire and sand into luminous sheets, vessels, and decorative pieces. Sunlight passes through stained windows, scattering colored patterns across stone floors. You feel the convergence of technical skill, patience, and creativity. A material once inert has been transformed into a tool, a medium, and a lens through which the world becomes perceptible in new ways. And you might wonder, if humans can transform simple sand into a medium that illuminates, measures, and inspires, what other latent potentials in ordinary materials, stones, metals, fibers, or liquids might quietly reshape human perception, technology, and culture if we learn how to harness them? By the late 15th century, glassmaking had firmly established itself as both an art and a technology that shaped medieval life in ways that extended far beyond beauty. From cathedrals to workshops, from practical containers to instruments of learning, glass had quietly transformed perception, culture, and human capability. Churches and cathedrals continued to display the greatest achievements in stained glass. Windows depicted vivid biblical narratives, saints, and moral lessons, designed to catch sunlight and scatter it in mesmerizing patterns across stone interiors. But by now, towns and urban dwellings were also using clear glass for windows. Interiors, once dim and shadowed, were filled with light, improving comfort, hygiene, and the ability to work or read. Glass allowed people to manipulate the environment subtly, controlling exposure, enhancing illumination, and even offering protection against wind and rain. Scientific applications expanded further. Glass lenses enabled eyeglasses to become more precise, supporting scholars and scribes in their work despite deteriorating vision. Instruments like astrolabes depended on accurate, transparent glass to measure and model the heavens. These tools turned glass into a medium of knowledge, a bridge between human senses and the broader cosmos. By bending and focusing light, glass amplified observation, enabling intellectual work that would have been impossible with the naked eye alone. Commerce and daily life also benefited. Glass vessels allowed liquids, oils, and medicines to be stored and transported safely, improving trade networks, food preservation, and health. Jewelry, beads, and decorative objects became markers of social status, while artisans specialized in diverse forms of glass, from practical wares to intricate luxury items. The material was both functional and symbolic. It conveyed wealth, skill, and sophistication, while quietly enhancing utility in everyday life. The technical mastery required for this work remained demanding. Crafting clear or colored glass, forming uniform panes, or producing precise lenses required careful attention to heat, composition, and timing. A single misstep could ruin hours of labor. Skilled artisans developed empirical knowledge passed through generations, blending observation, intuition, and experience in ways that prefigured scientific reasoning. The craft demanded both patience and creativity, and those who mastered it held knowledge that was both rare and valuable. Culturally, glass also shaped perception itself. By controlling light, color, and transparency, humans began to see the world differently. Interiors were brighter, objects more visible, and subtle detail became perceivable. The very act of seeing was mediated by human ingenuity. The senses extended through crafted materials. This quietly altered cognition, work, and aesthetics, demonstrating that even ordinary materials, when carefully manipulated, could reshape experience. Imagine standing in a workshop or cathedral, the furnace glowing, molten glass glowing like liquid fire, hands guiding the material into delicate panes or vessels. Sunlight passes through clear or colored glass, scattering brilliance across the walls. A scholar peers through a newly crafted lens, reading a manuscript previously blurred by failing vision. You feel the intersection of skill, patience, and observation, humans translating fire and sand into tools that extend perception, knowledge, and artistry. The medieval glassmaker in shaping light had done more than create beauty. They extended vision, amplified human labor, and transformed the way people interacted with the material and visual world. Their craft was a quiet revolution, a reminder that innovation can arise not only from grand inventions, but also from careful manipulation of the ordinary. Glass, fire, and sand together became a medium that reshaped perception, knowledge, and culture. And you might wonder, if the transformation of sand into glass can illuminate minds, spaces, and instruments of knowledge, what other hidden possibilities lie in the materials around us today, quietly waiting for human ingenuity to bring them to light?